Hello friends, welcome to Fantasy Realm Reads.
Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 1, in which Phileas Fogg and Passepartout accept each other, the one as master, the other as man. Mr. Phileas Fogg lived in 1872 at number 7 Savile Road, Burlington Gardens, the house in which Sheridan died in 1814. He was one of the most noticeable members of the Reform Club, though he seemed always to avoid attracting attention. An enigmatical personage, about whom little was known, except that he was a polished man of the world. People said that he resembled Byron, at least that he was Byronic, but he was a bearded, tranquil Byron, who might live on 1,000 years without growing old. Certainly an Englishman, it was more doubtful whether Phileas Fogg was a Londoner. He was never seen on charge, nor at the bank, nor in the counting rooms of the city. No ships ever came into London docks of which he was the owner. He had no public employment. He had never been entered at any of the inns of court, either at the Temple, or Lincoln's Inn, or Gray's Inn, nor had his voice ever resounded in the Court of Chancery, or in the Exchequer, or the Queen's Bench, or the ecclesiastical courts. He certainly was not a manufacturer, nor was he a merchant or gentleman farmer. His name was strange to the scientific and learned societies, and he never was known to take part in the sage deliberations of the Royal Institution or the London Institution, the Artisans' Association, or the Institution of Arts and Sciences. He belonged, in fact, to none of the numerous societies which swarm in the English capital, from the Harmonic to that of the entomologists, founded mainly for the purpose of abolishing pernicious insects. Phileas Fogg was a member of the Reform, and that was all. The way in which he got admission to his exclusive club was simple enough. He was recommended by the Barings, with whom he had an open credit. His chequis was regularly paid at sight from his account current, which was always flush. Was Phileas Fogg rich? Undoubtedly, but those who knew him best could not imagine how he had made his fortune, and Mr. Fogg was the last person to whom to apply for the information. He was not lavish, nor on the contrary avaricious, for whenever he knew that money was needed for a noble, useful, or benevolent purpose, he supplied it quietly and sometimes anonymously. He was, in short, the least communicative of men. He talked very little, and seemed all the more mysterious for his taciturn manner. His daily habits were quite open to observation, but whenever he did so exactly the same thing that he had always done before, that his wits of the curious were fairly puzzled. Had he travelled? It was likely, for no one seemed to know the world more familiarly than was no spot so secluded that he did not appear to have an intimate acquaintance with it. He often corrected with a few clear words the thousand conjectures advanced by members of the club as to lost and unheard of travellers, pointing out the true probabilities, and seeming as if gifted with a sort of second sight. So often did events justify his predications, he must have travelled everywhere, at least in the spirit. It was at least certain that Phileas Fogg had not absented himself from London for many years. Those who were honoured by a better acquaintance with him than the rest declared that nobody could pretended to have ever seen him anywhere else. His sole pastimes were reading the papers and playing whist. He often won at this game, which as a silent one, harmonized with his nature, but his winnings never went into his purse, being reserved as a fund for his charities. Mr. Fogg played not to win, but for the sake of playing. The game was in his eyes a contest, a struggle with a difficulty yet motionless, unwearying struggle, congenial to his tastes. Phileas Fogg was not known to have either wife or children, which may happen to the most honest people, either relatives or near friends, which is certainly more unusual. He lived alone in his house in Savile Road, whither none penetrated. A single domestic sufficed to serve him. He breakfasted and dined at the club, at hours mathematically fixed, in the same room, at the same table, never taking his meals with other members, much less bringing a guest with him, and went home at exactly midnight, only to retire at once to bed. He never used the cosy chambers which the Reform provided for its favoured members. He passed 10 hours out of the 24 in Savile Row, either in sleeping or making his toilet. When he chose to take a walk, it was with a regular step in the entrance hall, with its mosaic flooring, or in the circular gallery, with its dome supported by 20 red porphyry Ionic columns, and illuminated by blue painted windows. When he breakfasted or dined, all the resources of the club, its kitchens and pastries, its buttery and dairy, aided to crowd his table with their most succulent stories. He was served by the gravest waiters in dress coats and shoes with swan-skin soles, with proffered the veins in special porcelain, and on the finest linen club decanters of a lost mould containing his sherry, his port, and his cinnamon-spiced claret, while his beverages were refreshingly cool with ice, brought at great cost from the American lakes. If to live in this style is to be eccentric, it must be confessed that there is something good in eccentricity. The mansion in Savile Row, thought not sumptuous, was exceedingly comfortable. The habits of its occupants were such as to demand but little from the sole domestic, but Phileas Fogg required him to be almost superhumanly prompt and regular. On this very 2nd of October, he had dismissed James Forster, being that luckless youth had brought him serving water at 84 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 86, and he was awaiting his successor, who was due at the house between 11 and half past. Phileas Fogg was seated squarely in his armchair, his feet close together like those of a grenadier on parade, his hands resting on his knees, his body straight, his head erect. He was steadily watching a complicated clock which indicated the hours, the minutes, the seconds, the days, the months, and the years. At exactly 8:30, Mr. Fogg would, according to his daily habits, quit Savile Road and repair to the Reform. A rap at this moment sounded on the door of the cosy apartment where Phileas Fogg was seated, and James Forster, the dismissed servant, appeared. "The new servant," said he. A young man of 30 advanced and bowed. "You are a Frenchman, I believe?" asked Phileas Fogg, "and your name is John?" "Jean, if monsieur pleases," replied the newcomer. "Jean Passepartout, a surname which has clung to me because I have a natural aptness for going out of one business into another. I believe I'm honest, monsieur, but, to be outspoken, I've had several trades. I've been an itinerant singer, a circus rider when I used to vault like Leotard and dance on a rope like Blondin. Then I got to be a professional of gymnastics, so as to make better use of my talents. And then I was a surgeon fireman at Paris, an associate at many a big fire. But I quitted France 5 years ago, and wishing to taste the sweet of domestic life, took service as a valet here in England. Finding myself out of place, and hearing that Monsieur Phileas Fogg was the most exact and subtle gentleman in the United Kingdom, I have come to Monsieur in the hope of living with him a tranquil life, and forgetting even the name of Passepartout. Passepartout suits me, replied Mr. Fogg. You are well recommended to me. I hear a good report of you. You know my conditions? Yes, monsieur. Good. What time is it? 22 minutes after 11, replied Passepartout, drawing an enormous silver watch from the depths of his pocket. You're too slow, said Mr. Fogg. Pardon me, monsieur. It is impossible. You are 4 minutes too slow. No matter. It's enough to mention the error. Now from this time, 29 minutes after 11 a.m., this Wednesday, 2nd October, you are in my service. Phileas Fogg got up, took his hat in his left hand, put it on his head with an automatic motion, and went off without a word. Passepartout heard the street door shut once. It was his new master going out. He heard it shut again. It was his predecessor, James Forster, departing in his turn. Passepartout remained alone, the house in Savile Row. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, in which Passepartout is convinced that he has at last found his ideal. Faith, muttered Passepartout, somewhat flurried, I've seen people at Madame Tussaud's as lively as my new master. Madame Tussaud's people, let it be said, are of wax, and are much visited in London. Speech is all that is wanting to make them human. During his brief interview with Mr. Fogg, Passepartout has been carefully observing him. He appeared to be a man about 40 years of age, with fine, handsome features, and a tall, well-shaped figure. His hair and whiskers were light, his forehead compact and unwrinkled, his face rather pale, his teeth magnificent, his countenance possessed in the highest degree what physiognomists called him repose in action, a quality of those who act rather than talk. Calm and phlegmatic, with a clear eye, Mr. Fogg seemed a perfect type of that English composure which Angelica Kauffmann has so skilfully represented on canvas. Seen in the various phases of his daily life, he gave the idea of being perfectly well balanced, as exactly regulated as a Leary chronometer. Phileas Fogg was indeed exactitude personified, and this was betrayed even in the expression of his very hands and feet, for in men, as well as in animals, the limbs themselves are expressive of the passions. He was so exact that he was never in a hurry, was always ready, and was economical alike of his steps and his motions. He never took one step too many, and always went to his destination by the shortest cut. He made no superfluous gestures, and was never seen to be moved or agitated. He was the most deliberate person in the world, yet always reached his destination at the exact moment. He lived alone, and so to speak, outside of every social relation. And so he knew that in this world account must be taken of friction, and that friction retards. He never rubbed against anybody. As for Passepartout, he was a true Parisian of Paris, since he had abandoned his own country for England, taking service as a valet. He had in vain searched for a master after his own heart. Passepartout was by no means one of those part dunces depicted by Molière with a bold gaze and a nose held high in the air. He was an honest fellow, with a pleasant face, lips a trifle protruding, soft-mannered and serviceable, with a good round head, and as one likes to see on the shoulder of a friend. His eyes were blue, his complexion rubicund, his figure almost portly and well built, his body muscular, and his physical powers fully developed by the exercises of his younger days. His brown hair was somewhat tumbled, for while the ancient sculptors are said to have known 18 methods of arranging Minerva's treasures, Passepartout was familiar with but one of dressing his own. 3 strokes of a large tooth comb completed his toilet. It would be rash to predict how Passepartout's lively nature would agree with Mr. Fogg. It was impossible to tell whether the new servant would turn out as absolutely methodical as his master required. Experience alone could not solve the question. Passepartout had been a sort of vagrant in his early years, and now yearned for repose, but so far he had failed to find it, though he had already served in 10 English houses. But he could not take root in any of these. With chagrin, he found his master's invariability whimsical and irregular, constantly running about the country or on the lookout for adventure. His last master, young Lord Longferry, Member of Parliament, after passing his nights in the Haymarket taverns, was too often brought home in the morning on policemen's shoulders. Passepartout, desirous of respecting the gentlemen whom he served, ventured a mild remonstrance on such conduct, which, being ill received, he took his leave, hearing that Mr. Phileas Fogg was looking for a servant, and that his life was one of unbroken regularity, that he neither travelled nor stayed from home overnight. He felt sure that this would be the place he was after. He presented himself and was accompanied as he had been seen. At 11:30 then, Passepartout found himself alone in the house in Savile Row. He began its inspection without delay, scouring it from ceiling to garret. So clean, well arranged, solemn a mansion pleased him. It seemed to him like a snail's shell, lighted and warmed by gas, which sufficed for both these purposes. When Passepartout reached the 2nd story, he recognized at once the room which he was to inhabit, and he was well satisfied with it. Electric bells and speaking tubes afforded communication with the lower stories, while on the mantel stood an electric clock precisely like that in Mr. Fogg's bedchamber, both beating the same second at the same instant. "That's good, that'll do," said Passepartout to himself. He suddenly observed, hung over the clock, a card which inspection proved to be a programme of the daily routine of the house. It comprised all that was required of the servant from 8 in the morning, exactly at which hour Phileas Fogg rose, till 11:30, when he left the house for the Reform Club. All the details of service, the tea and toast at 23 minutes past 8, the shaving water at 37 minutes past 9, and the toilet at 20 minutes before 10. Everything was regulated and foreseen. That was to be done from 11:30 a.m. till midnight, the hour at which the methodical gentleman retired. Mr. Fogg's wardrobe was amply supplied and in the best taste. Each pair of trousers, coat, and vest bore a number, indicating the time of year and season at which they were to turn to be laid out for wearing, and the same system was applied to the master's shoes. In short, the house in Savile Row, which must have been a very temple of disorder and unrest under the illustrious but dissipated Sheridan, was coziness, comfort, and method idealist. There was no study, nor were there books, which would have been quite useless to Mr. Fogg, for at the Reform 2 libraries, one of general literature and the other of law and politics, were at his service. A moderate-sized safe stood in his bedroom, constructed so as to defy fire as well as burglars, but Passepartout found neither arms nor hunting weapons anywhere. Everything betrayed the most tranquil and peaceable habits. Having scrutinized the house from top to bottom, he rubbed his hands, a broad smile overspread his features, and he said joyfully, "This is just what I wanted. Ah, we shall get on together, Mr. Fogg and I. What a domestic and regular gentleman! A real machine. Well, I don't mind serving a machine." End of Chapter 2.
Chapter 3, in which a conversation takes place which seems likely to cost Phileas Fogg dear. Phileas Fogg, having shut the door of his house at 11:30, and having put his right foot before his left 575 times, and his left before his right 576 times, reached the Reform Club, an imposing edifice in Pall Mall, which could not have cost less than 3,000,000. He repaired at once to the dining-room, the 9 windows of which opened upon a tasteful garden, which the trees were already gilded with an autumn colouring, and took his place at the habitual table, the cover of which had already been laid for him. His breakfast consisted of a side dish, a broiled fish with Reading sauce, a scarlet slice of roast beef garnished with mushrooms, a rhubarb and gooseberry tart, and a morsel of Cheshire cheese, the whole being washed down with several cups of tea, for which the Reform is famous. He rose at 13 minutes to 1, and directed his steps towards the large hall, a sumptuous apartment adorned with lavishly framed paintings. A flunkey handed him an uncut Times, which he proceeded to cut with a skill which betrayed familiarity with this delicate operation. The perusal of this paper absorbed Phileas Fogg until a quarter before 4, whilst the Standard, his next task, occupied him till the dinner hour. Dinner passed as breakfast had done, and Mr. Fogg reappeared in the reading-room, and sat down to the Pall Mall at 20 minutes before 6. Half an hour later, several members of the Reform came in and drew up to the fireplace, where a coal fire was steadily burning. They were Mr. Fogg's usual partners at whist, Andrew Stott, an engineer, John Sullivan, and Samuel Fellenton, bankers, Thomas Flangelin, a brewer, and Gauthier Ralph, one of the directors of the Bank of England, all rich and highly respectable personages, even in a club which comprised the princes of English trade and finance. "Well, Ralph," said Thomas Flangelin, "what about that robbery?" "Oh," replied Stott, "the bank will lose the money." "On the contrary," broke in Ralph, "I hope we may put our hands on the robber. Skilful detectives have been sent to all the principal parts of America and the Continent, and he'll be a clever fellow if he slips through their fingers." "But have you got the robber's description?" asked Stuart. "In the first place, he is no robber at all," returned Ralph, positively. "What! A fellow who makes off with £55,000 no robber?" "No." "Perhaps he's a manufacturer, then." "The Daily Telegraph says that he is a gentleman." It was Phileas Fogg, who had now emerged from behind his newspaper, who made this remark. He bowed to his friends, and entered into the conversation. The affair which formed its subject, and which was town talk, had occurred 3 days before at the Bank of England. A package of banknotes to the value of £55,000 had been taken from the principal cashier's table, that functionary being at the moment engaged in registering the receipt of 3 shillings and sixpence. Of course, he could not have his eyes everywhere. Let it be observed that the Bank of England reposes a touching confidence in the honesty of the public. There are neither guards nor gratings to protect its treasures. Gold, silver, banknotes are freely exposed at the mercy of the first comer. A keen observer of England customs relates that, being in one of the rooms of the bank one day, he had the curiosity to examine a gold ingot weighing some 7 or 8 pounds. He took it up, scrutinized it, passed it to his neighbor, he to the next man, and so on until the ingot, going from hand to hand, was transferred to the end of a dark entry. Nor did it return to its place for half an hour. Meanwhile the cashier had not so much as raised his head. But in the present instance things had not gone so smoothly. The package of notes not being found when 5 o'clock sounded for the ponderous clock in the drawing office, the amount was passed to the account of profit and loss, and soon as the robbery was discovered, picked detectives hastened off to Liverpool, Glogslog, Harvey, Suez, Brinsley, New York, and other ports, inspired by the preferred reward of £2,000 and 5% on the sum that might be recovered. Detectives were also charged with narrowly watching those who arrived at or left London by rail, and a judicial examination was at once entered upon. There were real grounds for supposing, as the Daily Telegraph said, that the thief did not belong to a professional band. On the day of the robbery, a well-dressed gentleman of polished manners, and with a well-to-do air, had been observed going to and fro in the paying-room where the crime was committed. A description of him was easily procured, and sent to the detectives, and some hopeful spirits, of whom Ralph was one, did not despair of his apprehension. The papers and clubs were full of the affair, and everywhere people were discussing the probabilities of a successful pursuit, and the Reform Club was especially agitated, several of its members being bank officials. Ralph would not concede that the work of the detectives was likely to be in vain, for he thought that the prize offered would greatly stimulate their zeal and activity. But Stuart was far from sharing this confidence, and as they placed themselves at the whist table, they continued to argue the matter. Stuart and Flanagan played together, while Phileas Fogg and Fallentin for his partner. As the game proceeded, the conversation ceased, excepting between the rubbers, when it revived again. "I maintain," said Stuart, "that the chances are in favour of the thief. who must be a shrewd fellow. "Well, by where can he fly to?" asked Ralph. "No country is safe for him." "Phew! Where could he go, then?" "Oh, I don't know that. The world is big enough." "It was once," said Phileas Fogg, in a low tone. "Cut, sir," he added, handing the cards to Thomas Flanagan. The discussion fell during the rubber, after which Stuart took up its thread. "What do you mean by 'once'? Has the world grown smaller?" "Certainly," returned Ralph. "I agree with Mr. Fogg. The world has grown smaller since a man can now go round it in 10 times more quickly than 100 years ago. And that is why the search for this thief will be more likely to succeed. Also why the thief can get away more easily." "Be so good as to play, Mr. Stuart," said Phileas Fogg. But the incredulous Stuart was not convinced, and when the hand was finished, said eagerly, "You have a strange way, Ralph, of proving that the world has grown smaller. So because you can go round it in 3 months—" "In 80 days," interrupted Phileas Fogg. "That is true, gentlemen," added John Sullivan, "only 80 days. Now that the section between Roth and Allahabad on the Great Indian Peninsula Railway has been opened. Here is the estimate made by the Daily Telegraph. From London to Suez, via Mont Cenis and Brindisi, by rail and steamboat, 7 days. From Suez to Bombay, by steamer, 13 days. From Bombay to Calcutta, by rail, 3 days. From Calcutta to Hong Kong, by steamer, 13 days. From Hong Kong to Yokohama, Japan, by steamer, 6 days. From Yokohama to San Francisco, by steamer, 22 days. From San Francisco to New York, by rail, 7 days. From New York to London, by steamer and rail, 9 days. Total, 80 days. "Yes, in 80 days," exclaimed Stuart, who in his excitement made a false deal. "But that doesn't take into account bad weather, country winds, shipwrecks, railway accidents, and so on." "All included," returned Phileas Fogg, continuing to play despite the discussion. "But suppose the Hindoos or Indians pull up the rails," replied Stuart. "Suppose they stop the trains, pillage the luggage vans, and scalp the passengers." "All included," calmly retorted Mr. Fogg, adding, as he threw down the cards, "two trumps." Stuart, whose turn it was to deal, gathered them up, and went on. "You are right theoretically, Mr. Fogg, but practically also, Mr. Stuart. I'd like to see you do it in 80 days. It depends on you. Shall we go?" "Heaven preserve me! But I would wager £4,000 that such a journey made under these conditions is impossible." "Quite possible under the contrary," returned Mr. Fogg. "Well, make it, then." "The journey round the world in 80 days?" "Yes." "I should like nothing better." "When?" "At once. Only I warn you that I shall do it at your expense." "It's absurd!" cried Strutt, who was beginning to be annoyed at the persistency of his friend. "Come, let's get on with the game." "Deal over again, then," said Phileas Fogg. "There's a false deal." Strutt took up the pack with a feverish hand, then suddenly put them down again. "Well, Mr. Fogg," said he, "it shall be so. I will wager the 4,000 on it." "Calm yourself, my dear Stuart," said Thornton. "It's only a joke." "When I say I'll wager," returned Stuart, "I mean it." "All right," said Mr. Fogg, and turning to the others, he continued, "I have a deposit of 20,000 at Baring's, which I will willingly risk upon it." "£20,000!" cried Sullivan. "£20,000! Which you would lose by a single accident delay?" "The unforeseen does not exist," quietly replied Phileas Fogg. "But, Mr. Fogg, 80 days are only the estimate of the least possible time in which the journey can be made. A well-used minimum suffices for everything. But in order not to exceed it, you must jump mathematically from train upon steamer, from steamer upon train again." "I will jump mathematically." "You are joking." "A true Englishman doesn't joke when he's talking about so serious a thing as a wager," replied Mr. Fogg, solemnly. "I will bet £20,000 against anyone who wishes that I will make the tour of the world in 80 days or less, in 1920 hours, or 150,200 minutes. Do you accept?" "We accept," replied Messrs. Stuart, Fallentin, Sullivan, Flanagan, and Ralph, after consulting each other. "Good," said Mr. Fogg. "The train leaves for Dover at 9:15. I will take it." "This very evening?" asked Stuart. "This very evening," returned Phileas Fogg. He took out and consulted a pocket almanac, and added, "As today is Wednesday, the 2nd of October, I shall be due in London, in this very room of the Reform Club, on Saturday, the 21st of December, at 9:15 p.m., or else the £20,000 now deposited in my name at Baring's will belong to you, in fact and in right, gentlemen. Here is a cheque for the amount." A moment of the wager was at once drawn up and signed by the 6 parties, during which Phileas Fogg preserved a stoical composure. He certainly did not bet to win, and had only staked the £20,000, half of his fortune, because he foresaw that he might have to expend the other half to carry out this difficult, not to say unattainable, project. As for his antagonists, they seemed much agitated, not so much by the value of their stake as because they had some scruples about betting under conditions so difficult to their friend. The clock struck 7, and the party offered to suspend the game, so Mr. Fogg might make his preparations for departure. "I am quite ready now," was his tranquil response. "Diamonds are trumps. Be so good as to play, gentlemen." Chapter 4, in which Phileas Fogg astounds Passepartout, his servant. Having won 20 guineas at whist, and taken leave of his friends, Phileas Fogg, at 25 minutes past 7, left the Reform Club. Passepartout, who had conscientiously studied the programme of his duties, was more than surprised to see his master guilty of the inexactness of appearing at his unaccustomed hour, for, according to rule, he was not due in Savile Row until precisely midnight. Mr. Fogg repaired to his bedroom and called out, "Passepartout!" Passepartout did not reply. It could not be he who had called. It was not the right hour. "Passepartout!" replied Mr. Fogg, without raising his voice. Passepartout made his appearance. "I've called you twice," observed his master. "But it is not midnight," replied the other, showing his watch. "I know it. I don't blame you. We start for Dover and Calais in 10 minutes. A puzzled grin overspread Passepartout's round face. Clearly he had not comprehended his master. "Monsieur is going to leave home?" "Yes," replied Phileas Fogg. "We are going round the world." Passepartout opened his eyes, raised his eyebrows, held up his hands, and seemed about to collapse, so overcome was he with stupefied astonishment. "Round the world?" he murmured. "In 80 days," responded Mr. Fogg. "So we haven't a moment to lose." "But the trunks!" gasped Passepartout, unconsciously swaying his head from right to left. "We'll have no trunks, only a carpet bag, with 2 shirts and 3 pairs of stockings for me, and the same for you. We'll buy our clothes on the way. Bring down my mackintosh and travelling cloak, and some stout shoes, though we shall do little walking. Make haste!" Passepartout tried to reply, but he could not. He went out, mounted to his own room, fell into a chair, and muttered, "That's good, that is. And I, who wanted to remain quiet." He mechanically set about making the preparations for departure. Around the world in 80 days. Was his master a fool? No. Was this a joke, then? They were going to Dover. Good. To Calais. Good again. After all, Passepartout,
who had been away from France 5 years, would not be sorry to set foot on his native soil again. Perhaps they would go as far as Paris, and it would do his eyes good to see Paris once more. But surely a gentleman so chary of his steps would stop there, no doubt. But then it was none the less true that he was going away, this so domestic person hitherto. By 8 o'clock Passepartout had packed his modest carpet-bag, containing the wardrobes of his master and himself. Then, still troubled in mind, he carefully shut the door of his room and descended to Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was quite ready. Under his arm might have been observed a red-bound copy of Bradshaw's Continental Railway Steam Transit and General Guide, with its timetables showing the arrival and departure of steamers and railways. He took the carpet-bag, opened it, and slipped into it a goodly roll of Bank of England notes, which would pass wherever he might go. "You have forgotten nothing?" asked he. "Nothing, monsieur." "My mackintosh and cloak?" "Here they are." "Good. Take this carpet-bag," handing it to Passepartout. "Take good care of it, for there are 20,000 pounds in it." Passepartout nearly dropped the bag as if the 20,000 pounds were in gold, and weighed him down. Master and man then descended. The street door was double locked, and at the end of Savile Row they took a cab and drove rapidly to Charing's Cross. The cab stopped before the railway station at 20 minutes past 8. Passepartout jumped off the box and followed his master, who, after paying the cabman, was about to enter the station, when a poor beggar woman with a child in her arms, her naked feet smeared with mud, her head covered with a wretched bonnet from which hung a tattered feather, and her shoulders shuttered in the ragged shawl, approached and mournfully asked for alms. Mr. Fogg took out the 20 guineas he had just won at whist, and handed them to the beggar, saying, "Here, my good woman, I'm glad that I met you," and passed on. Passepartout had a moist sensation about the eyes. His master's action touched his susceptible heart. 2 first-class tickets for Paris having been speedily purchased, Mr. Fogg was crossing the station to the train when he perceived his favorite friends of the Reform Club. "Well, gentlemen," said he, "I'm off, you see, and if you will examine my passport when I get back, you'll be able to judge whether I have accomplished the journey agreed upon." "Oh, that would be quite unnecessary, Mr. Fogg," said Ralph politely. "We will trust your word as a gentleman of honor." "You do not forget when you are due in London again?" asked Strott. "In 80 days, on Saturday, the 21st of December, 1872, at a quarter hour before 9 p.m. Goodbye, gentlemen." Phileas Fogg and his servant seated themselves in a first-class carriage at 20 minutes before 9. 5 minutes later the whistle screamed, and the train slowly glided out of the station. The night was dark, and a fine steady rain was falling. Phileas Fogg, snugly ensconced in the corner, did not open his lips. Passepartout, not yet recovered from his stupefaction, clung mechanically to the carpet-bag with its enormous treasure. Just as the train was whirling through Sydenham, Passepartout suddenly uttered a cry of despair. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Fogg. "Alas! In my hurry I forgot." "What?" Turn off the gas in my room." "Very well, young man," returned Mr. Fogg coolly. "It will burn at your expense." End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5, in which a new species of funds unknown to the moneyed men appears on 'Change. Phileas Fogg rightly suspected that his departure from London would create a lively sensation at the West End. The news of the bet spread throughout the Reform Club, and afforded an exciting topic of conversation to its members. From the club, it soon got into the papers throughout England. The boasted tour of the world was talked about, disputed, argued with as much warmth as if the subject were another Alabama claim. Some took sides with Phileas Fogg, but the large majority shook their heads and declared against him. It was absurd, impossible, they declared, that the tour of the world could be made, except theoretically and on paper, in this minimum of time and with this existing means of traveling. In the Times, Standard, Morning Post, and Daily News, and 20 other highly respectable newspapers scouted Mr. Fogg's project as madness. The Daily Telegraph alone hesitatingly supported him. People in general thought him a lunatic and blamed his Reform Club friends for having accepted a wager which betrayed the mental aberration of its proposer. Articles no less passionate than logical appeared on the question, for geography is one of the past subjects of the English, and the columns devoted to Phileas Fogg's venture were eagerly devoured by all classes of readers. At first, some rash individuals, principally of the gentler sex, espoused his cause, which, because still more popular, when the Illustrated London News came out with his portrait copied from a photograph in the Reform Club. A few readers of the Daily Telegraph even dared to say, "Why not, after all? Stranger things have come to pass." At last, a long article appeared on the 7th of October in the Bulletin of the Royal Geographical Society, which treated the question from every point of view, and demonstrated the utter folly of the enterprise. Everything, it said, was against the travellers, even obstacles imposed alike by man and by nature. A miraculous agreement of the times of departures and arrivals, which was impossible, was absolutely necessary to his success. He might perhaps reckon on the arrival of trains at the designated hours in Europe, with the distances were relatively moderate, but when he calculated upon crossing the India in 3 days and the United States in 7, could he really beyond misgiving upon accomplishment his task? Where was accidents to machinery, and liability of trains to run off the line, collisions, bad weather, the blocking up by snow? Were not all these things against Phileas Fogg? Would he not find himself, when travelling by steamer in winter, at the mercy of the winds and fogs? It is not uncommon for the best ocean steamers to be 2 or 3 days behind time, but a single delay would suffice to fatally break the chain of communication. Should Phileas Fogg once miss even by an hour a steamer, he would have to wait for the next, and that would irrevocably render his attempt in vain. This article made a great deal of noise, and being copied into all the papers, seriously depressed the advocates of the rash tourist. Everybody knows that England is the world of betting men, who are of higher class than mere gamblers. To bet is an English temperament. Not only the members of the Reform, but the general public made heavy wagers for or against Phileas Fogg, who was set down in betting books as if he was a racehorse. Bonds were issued, and their appearance on charge, Phileas Fogg bonds, were offered at par or at a premium, and a great business was done to them. But 5 days after the article in the Bulletin of the Geographical Society appeared, the demand began to subside. Phileas Fogg declined. They were offered by packages, at first of 5, then of 10, till at least nobody would take less than 20, 50, 100. London Albemarle, an elderly paralytic gentleman, was now the only advocate of Phileas Fogg left. This noble lord, fastened to his chair, would have given his fortune to be able to make the tour of the world. If it took 10 years, and he bet £5,000 on Phileas Fogg, when the folly as well as uselessness of the adventure was pointed out to him, he continued himself with replying, "If the thing is feasible, the first to do it ought to be an Englishman." The Fogg party dwindled more and more. Everybody was going against him, and the bets stood 150 and 200 to 1. And a week after his departure an incident occurred which deprived him of backers at any price. The Commission of Police was sitting in his office at 9 o'clock one evening when the following telegraph dispatch was put into his hands: "Suez to London. Rowan, Commissioner of Police, Scotland Yard. I found the bank robber, Phileas Fogg. Send without delay warrant of arrest to Bombay. Fix, Detective." The effort of this dispatch was instantaneous. The polished gentleman despaired to give place to the bank robber. His photograph, which was hung with those of the rest of the members of the Reform Club, was mutually examined, and it betrayed, feature by feature, the description of the robber which had been provided to the police. The mysterious habits of Phileas Fogg were recalled, his solitary ways, his sudden departure, and it seemed clear that, in undertaking a tour round the world on the pretext of a wager, he had no other end in view than to elude the detective and throw off his track. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6, in which Fix, the detective, betrays a very natural impudence. The circumstances under which this telegraphic dispatch about Phileas Fogg was sent were as follows. The steamer Mongolia, belonging to the Peninsular and Oriental Company, built of iron, of 2,800 tons burden and 500 horsepower, was due at 11 o'clock a.m. on Wednesday, the 9th of October, at Suez, Mongolia, plied regularly between Brindisi and Bombay via the Suez Canal, and was one of the fastest steamers belonging to the company, always making more than 10 knots an hour between Brindisi and Suez, and 9.5 between Suez and Bombay. Two men premeditating up and down the wharves among the crowd of natives and strangers who were sojourning at this once straggling village, now, thanks to the enterprise of M. Lesseps, a fast-growing town. One was the British consul at Suez, who, despite the prophecies of the English government and the unfavorable predictions of Stephenson, who, in the habit of seeing from his office window English ships daily passing to and fro on the great canal, by which the old roundabout route from England to India by the Cape of Good Hope was abridged by at least a half. The other was a small, slight-built personage with a nervous, intelligent face and bright eyes peering out from under eyebrows, which he was inconsistently twitching. He was just now manifesting unmistakable signs of impotence, nervously pacing up and down and unable to stand still for a moment. This was Fix, one of the detectives who had been dispatched from England in search of the bank robber. It was his task to narrowly watch every passenger who arrived at Suez and to follow up all who seemed to be suspicious characters or bore a resemblance to the description of the criminal which he had received 2 days before from the police headquarters at London. The detective was evidently inspired by the hope of obtaining the splendid reward which would be the prize of success, and awaited with a feverish impatience, easy to understand, the arrival of the steamer Mongolia. "So you say, Counsel," asked he for the 20th time, that this steamer is never behind time?" "No, Mr. Fix," replied the consul. "She was bespoker yesterday at port. Said the rest of the way is no account of such a craft. I repeat that the Mongolia has been in advance of time required by the company's regulations, and gained the prize awarded for excess of speed." "Does she come directly from Brindisi?" "Directly from Brindisi. She takes on the Indian mails there, and she left there Saturday at 5 p.m. Have patience, Mr. Fix. She will not be late. But really, I don't see how from the description you have will be able to recognize your man, even if he is on board the Mongolia." "A man rather feels the presence of these fellows, consul, than recognizes them. You must have a scent for them, and a scent like a sixth sense, which combines hearing, seeing, and smelling. I've arrested more than one of these gentlemen in my time, and if my thief is on board, I'll answer for it. He'll not slip through my fingers." "I hope so, Mr. Fix. But it was a heavy robbery." "A magnificent robbery, consul. £55,000. We don't often have such windfalls. Burglars are getting to be so contemptible nowadays. A fellow gets hung for a handful of shillings." "Mr. Fix," said the consul, "I like your way of talking, and hope you'll succeed. But I fear you'll find it far from easy. Don't you see, the description with which you have there has a singular resemblance to an honest man." "Consul," remarked the detective dogmatically, "great robbers always resemble honest folks. Fellows who have rascal faces have only one course to take, and that is to remain honest. Otherwise they would be arrested offhand. The artistic thing is to unmask honest countenance, and it's no light task, I admit, but a real art." Mr. Fix evidently was not wanting in a tangle of self-conceit. Little by little the scene on the quay became more animated. Sailors of various nations, merchants, shipbrokers, ports, fellahs, busted to and fro as if the steamer was immediately expected. The weather was clear and slightly chilly. The minarets of the town loomed above the houses in pale rays of the sun. A jetty pair, some 2,000 yards long, extended into the roadstead. A number of fishing smacks and coasting boats, some remaining the fantastic fashion of ancient galleys, were discernible on the Red Sea. As he passed among the busy crowd, Fix, according to habit, scrutinized the passers-by with a keen, rapid glance. It was now 10:30. "The steamer doesn't come," he examined as the port clock struck. "She can't be far off now," replied his companion. "How long is she stop at Suez?" "4 hours. Long enough to get in her coal. It is 1,310 miles from Suez to Aden, at the other end of the Red Sea, and she has to take in a fresh coal supply." "And does she go from Suez directly to Bombay?" "Without putting in anywhere." "Good," said Fix. "If the robber is on board, he will no doubt get off Suez so as to reach the Dutch or French colonies in Asia by some other route. He ought to know that he would not be safe an hour in India, which is English soil." "Unless," objected the counselor, "he is exceptionally shrewd. An English criminal, you know, is always better concealed in London than anywhere else." This observation furnished the detectives food for thought, and meanwhile the consul went away to his office. Fix, left alone, was more impotent than ever, having a presentiment that the robber was on board the Mongolia. If he had indeed left London intentionally to reach the New World, he would naturally take the route via India, which was less watched and more difficult to watch than that of the Atlantic. But Fix's reflections were soon interrupted by a succession of sharp whistles which announced the arrival of the Mongolia. The porters and Phileas rushed down the quay, and a dozen boats pushed off from the shore to go and meet the steamer. Soon her gigantic hull appeared passing along between the banks, and 11 o'clock struck as she anchored in the road. She brought an unusual number of passengers, some of whom remained on deck to scan the picturesque panorama of the town, while the greater part disembarked in the boats and landed on the quay. Fix took up a position and carefully examined each face and figure which made its appearance. Presently one of the passengers, after vigorously pushing his way through the importunate crowd of porters, came up to him and politely asked if he could point out the English consulate, at the same time showing a passport which he wished to have visaed. Fix instinctively took the passport, and with a rapid glance read the description of the bearer. An involuntary motion of surprise nearly escaped him, for the description in the passport was identical with that of the bank robber which he had received from Scotland Yard. "Is this your passport?" asked he. "No, it's my master's." "And your master is—" "He stays on board." "But he must go to council in person, so as to establish his identity." "Oh, is that necessary?" "Quite indispensable." "And where is this consulate?" "There on the corner of the square," said Fix, pointing to a house 200 steps off. "I'll go and fetch my master, who won't be much pleased, however, to be disturbed." The passenger bowed to Fix and returned to the steamer. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7, which once more demonstrates the uselessness of passports as aids to detectives. The detective passed down the quay and rapidly made his way to the counsel's office, where he was at once admitted to the presence of the official. "Counsel," said he, without preamble, "I have strong reasons for believing that my man is a passenger on the Mongolia." And he narrated what had just passed concerning the passport. "Well, Mr. Fix," replied the counsel, "I shall not be sorry to see the rascal's face, but perhaps he won't come here. That is, if he is the person you suppose him to be, a robber. Doesn't quite like to leave traces of his flights behind him, and besides, he is not obligated to have his passport countersigned. If he is as shrewd as I think he is, counsel, he will come." "To have his passport visaed?" "Yes, passports are only good for annoying honest folks, and aiding in the flight of rogues. I assure you it will be quite the thing for him to do. But I hope you will not visa the passport." "Why not? If the passport is genuine, I have no right to refuse. Still, I must keep this man here until I get a warrant to arrest him from London." "Ah, that's your lookout. But I cannot—" The counsel did not finish his sentence, for as he spoke a knock was heard at the door, and two strangers entered, one of whom was the servant whom Fix had met on the quay. The other, who was the master, held out his passport with the request that the counsel would do him the favor to visa it. The counsel took the document and carefully read it, whilst Fix observed, or rather devoured, the stranger with his eyes from a corner of the room. "You are Mr. Phileas Fogg?" said the counsel, after reading the passport. "I am." "And this man is your servant?" "He is. A Frenchman, and Passepartout." You are from London? Yes. And you are going to Bombay? Very good, sir. You know that a visa is useless, and that no passport is required? I know it, sir, replied Phileas Fogg, but I wish to prove by your visa that I came by Suez. Very well, sir. The counsel proceeded to sign and date the passport, after which he added his official seal. Mr. Fogg paid the customary fee, coldly bowed, and went out, followed by his servant. "Well?" queried the detective. "Well, he looks and acts like a perfectly honest man," replied the counsel. "Possibly. But that is not the question. Do you think, counsel, that this fleegment gentleman resembles, features by feature, the robber whose description I have received?" "I concede that. But, you know, all descriptions—" "I'll make certain of it," inquired Fix. "The servant seems to me less mysterious than the master. Besides, he's a Frenchman, and can't help talking. Excuse me for a little while, counsel." Fix started off in search of Passepartout. Meanwhile, Mr. Fogg, after leaving the consulate, repaired to the quay, gave him orders to Passepartout, went off to the Mongolia in a boat, and descended to his cabin. He took up his notebook, which contained the following memoranda: "Left London, Wednesday, October 2nd, at 8:45 p.m. Reached Paris, Thursday, October 3rd, at 7:20 a.m. Left Paris, Thursday, at 8:40 a.m. Reached Turin by Mount Cenis, Friday, October 4th, at 6:35 a.m. Left Turin, Friday, at 7:20 a.m. Arrived at Brindisi, Saturday, October 5th, at 4 p.m. Sailed on the Mongolia, Saturday, at 5 p.m. Reached Suez, Wednesday, October 9th, at 11 a.m. Total hours spent, 158 plus, or in days, 6 days and a half." These dates were inscribed in an itinerary divided into columns, indicating the month, the day of the month, and the day for the stipulated and actual arrivals at each principal point: Paris, Brindisi, Suez, Bombay, Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong, Yakima, San Francisco, New York, and London, from the 2nd of October to the 21st of December, and given a space for setting down the gain made or loss sufficed on arrival at each locally. This methodical record thus contained an account of everything needed, and Mr. Fogg always knew whether he was behindhand or in advance of his time. On this Friday, October 9th, he noted his arrival at Suez, and observed that he has yet neither gained nor lost. He sat down quietly to breakfast in his cabin, never once thinking of inspecting the town, being one of those Englishmen who are wont to see foreign countries through the eyes of their domestics. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8, in which Passepartout talks rather more, perhaps, than is prudent. Fix soon rejoined Passepartout, who was longing and looking about on the quay, as if he did not feel that he, at least, was obligated not to see anything. "Well, my friend," said the detective, coming up with him, "is your passport visaed?" "Ah, it's you." "Is it, monsieur?" responded Passepartout. "Thanks, yes, the passport is all right." "And you are looking about you?" "Yes, but we travel so fast that I seem to be journeying in a dream. So this is Suez?" "Yes." "In Egypt?" "Certainly in Egypt." "And in Africa?" "In Africa." "In Africa!" repeated Passepartout. "Just think, monsieur, I had no idea that we should go further than Paris, and all that I saw of Paris was between 20 minutes past 7 and 20 minutes before 9 in the morning. between the Northern and the Lions stationed through the windows of a car and in a driving rain. How I regret not having seen once more Pere Lachaise and the circus in the Champs-Élysées. You are in a great hurry, then? I am not, but my master is. By the way, I must buy some shoes and shirts. We came away without trunks, only with a carpet bag. I will show you an excellent shop for getting what you want. Really, monsieur, you are very kind. And they walked off together, Passepartout chattering volubly as he went along. Above all, said he, don't let me lose the steamer. You have plenty of time. It's only 12 o'clock. Passepartout pulled out his big watch. 12, he examined. Why, it's only 8 minutes before 10. Your watch is slow. My watch? A family watch, monsieur, which has come down from my great-grandfather. It doesn't vary 5 minutes in this year. It's a perfect chronometer. Look you. I see how it is, said Fix. You have kept the London time, which is 2 hours behind that of Suez. You ought to regulate your watch at noon in each country. I regulate my watch? Never! Well then, it will not agree with the sun. So much for the worse for the sun, monsieur. The sun will be wrong then. And the worthy fellow returned the watch to its fob with a defiant gesture. After a few minutes' silence, Fix resumed. You left London hastily then? I rather think so. Last Friday at 8 o'clock in the evening, Monsieur Fogg came home from his club, and 3/4 of an hour afterwards we were off. But where is your master going? Always straight ahead. He's going round the world. Round the world? Cried Fix. Yes, in 80 days. He says it is on a wager, but between us, I don't believe a word of it. That wouldn't be common sense. There's something else in the wind. Ah, Mr. Fogg is a character, is he? I should say he is. Is he rich? No doubt, for he is carrying an enormous sum in brand new banknotes with him. And he doesn't spare the money on the way, either. He has offered a large reward to the engineer of the Mongolia if he gets us to Bombay well in advance of time. And you know your master a long time? Why, no, I entered his service the very day we left London. The effect of these replies upon the already suspicious and excited detective may be imagined. The hasty departure from London soon after the robbery, the large sum carried by Mr. Fogg, his eagerness to reach distant countries, the pretext of an eccentric and foolhardy bet, all confirmed Fix in his theory. He continued to pump poor Passepartout, and learned that he really knew little or nothing of his master, who lived a solitary existence in London, who said to be rich, though not one knew whence came his riches, and was mysterious and impenetrable in his affairs and habits. Fix felt sure that Phileas Fogg would not land at Suez, but was really going to Bombay. Is Bombay far from here? asked Passepartout. Pretty far. It is 10 days' voyage by sea. And in what country is Bombay? India? In Asia? Certainly. The deuce! I was going to tell you there's one thing that worries me. My burner. What burner? My gas burner, which I forgot to turn off, and which is at the moment burning at my expense. I've calculated, monsieur, that I lose 2 shillings every 24 hours, exactly 6 pence more than I earn. And you will understand that the longer our journey... Did Fix pay any attention to Passepartout's troubles about the gas? It is not his problem. He was not listening, but was conjugating a project. Passepartout and he had now reached the shop where Fix left his companion to make his purchases, after recommending him not to miss the steamer, and hurried back to the consulate. Now that he was fully convinced, Fix had quite recovered his equanimity. "Counsel," said he, "I have no longer any doubt I have spotted my man. He passed himself off as an odd stick who is going round the world in 80 days. "Then he's a sharp fellow," retorted the counsel, "and counts on returning to London after putting the police of the two countries off his track." "We'll see about that," replied Fix. "But are you not mistaken?" "I am not mistaken." Why was this robber so anxious to prove by the visa that he had passed through Suez? Why, I have no idea, but listen to me. He reported in a few words the most important parts of his conversation with Passepartout. "In short," said the counsel, "appearances are wholly against this man, and what are you going to do? Send a dispatch to London for a warrant of arrest to be dispatched instantly to Bombay, taking passage on board the Mongolia, following my rogue to India, and there on English grounds arrest him politically with my warrant in my hand and my hand on his shoulder." Having uttered these words with a cool, careless air, the detective took leave of the counsel and repaired to the telegraph office, whence he sent the dispatch which we have seen to the London police office. A quarter of an hour later found Fix, with a small bag in his hands, proceeding on board the Mongolia, and ere many moments longer the noble steamer rode out at full steam upon the waters of the Red Sea. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, in which the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean prove propitious to the designs of Phileas Fogg. The distance between Suez and Aden is precisely 1,310 miles, and the regulations of the company allow the steamers 138 hours in which to traverse it. The Mongolia, thanks to the vigorous exertions of the engineer, seemed likely, so rapid was her speed, to reach her destination considerably within that time. The greater part of the passengers from Brindisi were bound for India, some for Bombay, others for Calcutta by way of Bombay, the nearest route thitherto, now that a railway crosses the Indian peninsula. Among the passengers was a number of officials and military officers of various grades, the latter being either attached to the regular British forces or commanding the Sepoy troops, and receiving high salaries ever since the central government has assumed the powers of the East Indian Company. For the sub-lieutenants got £280, brigadiers £240, and generals of divisions £4,000. What with the military men, a number of rich young Englishmen on their travels, and the hospitable efforts of the purser, the time passed quickly on the Mongolia. The best of fare was spread upon the cabin tables at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the 8 o'clock supper, and the ladies scrupulously changed their toilets twice a day, and the hours were whirled away when the sea was tranquil with music, dancing, and games. But the Red Sea is full of caprice, and often boisterous, like most long and narrow gulfs. When the wind came from the African or Asian coast, the Mongolia, with her long hull, rolled fearfully. Then the ladies speedily disappeared below. The pianos were silent. Singing and dancing suddenly ceased. Yet the good ship plugged straight on, unretarded by the wind or wave, towards the Strait of Bab-el-Mandab. What was Phileas Fogg doing all this time? It might be thought that, in his anxiety, he would be constantly watching the changes of the wind and disorderly raging of the billows. Every chance, in short, which might force the Mongolia to slacken her speed, and thus interrupted his journey. But if he thought of the possibilities, he did not betray the fact by any outward sign. Always the same impassible member of the Reform Club, whom no incident could surprise, as unvarying as the ship's chronometers, and seldom having the curiosity even to go upon the deck, he passed through the memorable senses of the Red Sea with cold indifference, did not care to recognize his historic towns and villages which along its borders raised their picturesque outlines against the sky, and betrayed no fear of the dangers of the Arabic Gulf, which the old historians always spoke of with horror, and upon which the ancient navigators never ventured without propitiating the gods by ample sacrifices. How did this eccentric personage pass his time on the Mongolia? He made his 4 hearty meals every day, regardless of the most persistent rolling and pitching on the part of the steamer, and he played whist indefatigably, for he had found partners as enthusiastic in the game as himself. A tax collector on the way to his post at Goa, the Rev. Dismissed Smith, returned to his parish at Bombay, and a brigadier general of the English army, who was about to rejoin his brigade at Benares, made up the party, and with Mr. Fogg played whist by the hour together in absorbing silence. As for Passepartout, he too had escaped seasickness, and took his meals conscientiously in the forward cabin. He rather enjoyed the voyage, for he was well fed, well lodged, took great interest in the scenes through which they were passing, and consoled himself with the delusion that his master's whim would end at Bombay. He was pleased, on the day after leaving Suez, to find on deck the obliging person with whom he had walked and chatted on the quays. "If I am not mistaken," said he, approaching this person with his most amiable smile, "you are the gentleman who so kindly volunteered to guide me at Suez. Ah, I quite recognize you. You are the servant of the strange Englishman?" "Just so, monsieur." "Fix." "Monsieur Fix," resumed Passepartout, "I am charmed to find you on board. Where are you bound?" "Like you, to Bombay." "That's capital. Have you made this trip before?" "Several times." "I am one of the agents of the Peninsular Company." "Then you know India?" "Why, yes," replied Fix, who spoke cautiously. "A curious place, this India." "Oh, very curious, squaw. Minarets, temples, fakirs, pagodas, tigers, snakes, elephants. I hope you will have ample time to see the sights." "I hope so, Monsieur Fix. You see, a man of sound sense ought not to spend his life jumping from a steamer upon a railway train, and from a railway train upon a steamer again, pretending to make the tour of the world in 80 days. No, all this gymnastics, you will be sure, will cease at Bombay." "And Mr. Fogg is getting on well?" said Fix, in the most natural tone in the world. "Quite well, and I too. I eat like a famished ogre. It's the sea air." "But I never see your master on deck." "Never. He hasn't the least curiosity." "Do you know, Mr. Passepartout, that this pretended tour in 80 days may conceal some secret errand, perhaps a diplomatic mission?" "Faith, Monsieur Fix, I assure you I know nothing about it, nor would I give half a crown to find out." After this meeting, Passepartout and Fix got into the habit of chatting together, the latter making it a point to gain the worthy's man's confidence, he frequently offered him a glass of whiskey or pale ale in the steamer barroom, which Passepartout never failed to accept with graceful alacrity, mentally pronouncing Fix the best of good fellows. Meanwhile, the Mongolia was pushing forward rapidly on the 13th. Mocha, surrounded by its ruined walls wherein date trees were growing, was sighted, and on the mountains beyond were espied vast coffee fields. Passepartout was ravished to behold this celebrated place, and thought that, with its circular walls and dismantled fort, it looked like an immense coffee cup and saucer. The following night they passed through the Strait of Bab el Mandeb, which means in Arabic the Bridge of Tears, and the next day they put in at steamer port northwest of Aden Heriboir to take in coal. This matter of fueling steamers is a serious one at such distances from the coal mines. It costs the Peninsular Company some £800,000 a year. In these distant seas, coal is worth £3 or £4 sterling a ton. The Mongolia has still 1,650 miles to traverse before reaching Bombay, and was obligated to remain 4 hours at steamer point to coal up. But this delay, as it was foreseen, did not affect Phileas Fogg's programme. Besides, the Mongolia, instead of reaching Aden in the morning of the 15th, when she was due, arrived there on the evening of the 14th, a gain of 15 hours. Mr. Fogg and his servant went ashore to Aden to have the passport again visaed. Fix, unobserved, followed them. The visa procured, Mr. Fogg returned on board to resume his former habits, while Passepartout, according to custom, sauntered among the mixed population of Somalis, Benais, Parisis, Jews, Arabs, and Europeans, who comprised that 25,000 inhabitants of Aden. He gazed with wonder upon the fortifications which make this place the Gibraltar of the Indian Ocean, and the vast cisterns which the English engineers were still at work 2,000 years after the engineers of Solomon. Very curious, said Passepartout to himself, on returning to the steamer. I see that it is by no means useless to travel if a man wants to see something new. At 6 p.m. the Mongolia slowly moved out of the roadstead, and was soon once more on the Indian Ocean. She had 168 hours in which to reach Bombay, and the sea was favorable, the wind being in the northwest, and all sails aiding the engine. The steamer rolled but little. The ladies in fresh toilets reappeared on deck, and the singing and dancing were resumed. The trip was being accomplished most successfully, and Passepartout was enchanted with the congenial companion which chance had secured him to the person of the delightful Fix. On Sunday, October 20th, towards noon, they came in sight of the Indian coast. 2 hours later, the pilot came on board. A range of hills lay against the sky of the horizon, and soon the rows of palms which adorn Bombay came distinctly into view. The steamer entered the road formed by the islands in the bay, and at 4:30 she hauled up at the quays of Bombay. Phileas Fogg was in the act of finishing the 33rd rubber of the voyage, and his partner and himself, having by bold stroke captured all 13 of the tricks, concluded this fine campaign with a brilliant victory. The Mongolia was due at Bombay on the 22nd. She arrived on the 20th. This was a gain to Phileas Fogg of 2 days since his departure from London, and he calmly entered the fact in the itineraries in the column of gains. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10, in which Passepartout is only too glad to get off with the loss of his shoe. Everybody knows that the great reversed triangle of the land, with its base in the north and its apex in the south, which is called India, embezzles 1,400,000 square miles, upon which is spread unequally a population of 180 million of souls. The British Crown exercises a real and despotic domain over the larger portion of this vast country, and has a government general stationed at Calcutta, governors at Madras, Bombay, and in Bengal, and a lieutenant governor at Arja. But British India, properly so called, only embraces 700,000 square miles, and a population of from 100 to 110 millions of inhabitants. A considerable portion of India is still free from British authority, and there are certain fortuitous Rahas in the interior who are absolutely independent. The celebrated East India Company was all-powerful from 1756, when the English first gained a foothold on the spot where now stands the city of Madras, down to the time of the great sepoy insurrection. It gradually annexed province after province, purchasing them off the native chiefs whom it seldom paid, and appointed the Governor-General and his subordinates, civil and military. But the East India Company has now passed away, leaving the British possessions in India directly under the control of the Crown. The aspects of the country, as well as the manners and destructions of race, is daily changing. Formerly, one was obliged to travel in India by the old cumbrous method of going on foot or on horseback in palanquins or unwieldy coaches. Now, fast steamboats ply on the Indus and the Ganges, and a great railway with branch lines joining the main line at many points on its route traverse the peninsula from Bombay to Calcutta in 3 days. This railway does not run in a direct line across India. The distance between Bombay and Calcutta, as the bird flies, is only from 1,000 to 1,100 miles. But the deflections of the road increase this distance by more than a third. The general route of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway is as follows. Leaving Bombay, it passes through Calcutta, crossing to the continent opposite Tena, goes over the chain of Western Ghats, runs through northeast as far as Berhampur, skirts and nearly independent territory of Bunclare, ascends to Allahabad, turns thence eastward, meeting the Ganges at Banners, thus departs from the river a little, and descending southeastward by Burdwan and French town of Chandigarh, has its terminus at Calcutta. The passengers of the Mongolia went ashore at 4:30 p.m. At exactly 8 the train would start for Calcutta. Mr. Fogg, after bidding goodbye to his whist partners, left the steamer, gave his servant several errands to do, urged it upon him to be at the station promptly at 8, and with his regular step, which beat to the second, like an astronomical clock, directed his steps to the passport office. As for the wonders of Bombay, its famous city hall, its splendid library, its forts and docks, its bazaars, Moscow's synagogues, its American churches, and the noble pagoda on Malabar Hill, with its 2 polygonal towers. He cared not a straw to see them. He would not deign to examine even the masterpiece of Elephanta, or the mysterious Hognia concealed southeast from the docks, or those fine remains of Buddhist architecture, the Kanheri grottos of the island of Calcutta. Having transacted his business at the passport office, Phileas Fogg repaired quietly to the railway station, where he ordered dinner. Among the dishes served up to him, the landlord especially recommended a certain giblet of native rabbit, on which he prided himself. Mr. Fogg accordingly tasted the dish, but despite its spiced sauce, found it far from palatable. He rang for the landlord, and on his appearance said, fixing his clear eyes upon him, "Is this rabbit, sir?" "Yes, my lord," the rogue bully replied. "Rabbit from the jungles." And this rabbit did not know when he was killed. "Mew, my lord, what a rabbit mew, I swear to you." "Be so good, landlord, as not to swear, but remember this. Cats were formerly considered in India as sacred animals. That was a good time." "For the cats, my lord?" "Perhaps for this traveller's as well." After which Mr. Fogg quietly continued his dinner. Fix had gone on shore shortly after Mr. Fogg, and his first destination was the headquarters of Bombay Police. He made himself known as a London detective, told his business at Bombay, and the position of affairs relative to the supposed robber, and nervously asked if a warrant had arrived from London. It had not reached the office. Indeed, there had not yet been time for it to arrive. Fix was sorely disappointed, and tried to obtain an order of arrest from the director of Bombay Police. This the director refused, as the matter concerned the London office, which alone could legally deliver the warrant. Fix did not insist, and was fain to resign himself to await the arrival of the important document. But he was determined not to lose sight of the mysterious rogue as long as he stayed in Bombay. He did not doubt for a moment, any more than Passepartout, that Phileas Fogg would remain there, at least until it was time for a warrant to arrive. Passepartout, however, had no sooner heard his master's orders on leaving the Mongolia than he saw at once that they were to leave Bombay as they had done Suez and Paris, and that the journey would be extended at least as far as Calcutta, and perhaps beyond that place. He began to ask himself if this bet that Mr. Fogg talked about was not really in good earnest, and whether his fate was not in truth forcing him, despite his love of repose, around the world in 80 days. Having purchased the usual quota of shirts and shoes, he took a leisurely promenade about the streets, where crowds of people of many nationalities, Europeans, Parisians with pointed caps, Banyans with round turbans, Sindhus with square bonnets, Parsees with black mitres, and long-robed Armenians were collected. It happened to be the day of a Parsee festival. These descendants of the sect of Zoroaster, the most thrifty, civilized, intelligent, and auspicious of the East Indians, among whom are contacted the richest native merchants of Bombay, were celebrating a sort of religious carnival, with processions and shows, in the midst of which India dancing girls, clothed in rose-colored gues loped up with gold and silver, danced airily, but with perfect modesty, to the sound of violas and the clanging of tambourines. It is needless to say that Passepartout watched these circus ceremonies with staring eyes and gaping mouth, and that his countenance was that of the greenest booby imaginable. Unhappily for his master, as well as himself, his curiosity drew him unconsciously farther off than he intended to go. At least, having seen the Paris Carnival wind away in the distance, he was turning his steps towards the station, when he happened to espy the splendid pagoda on Malabar Hill, and was seized with an irresistible desire to see its interior. He was quite ignorant that it is forbidden to Christians to enter certain Indian temples, and that even the faithful must not go in without first leaving their shoes outside the door. It must be said that here that the wise policy of the British government severely punishes a disregard of the practices of the native religions. Passepartout, however, thinking no harm, went in like a simple tourist, and was soon lost in admiration of the splendid Brahmin ornamentation which everywhere met his eyes, when of a sudden he found himself sprawling on the sacred flagging. He looked up to behold three enraged priests, who forthwith fell upon him, tore off his shoes, and began to beat him with loud, savage exclamations. The agile Frenchman was soon upon his feet again, and lost no time in knocking down two of his long-gowed adversaries with his fists and vigorous application of his toes. Then, rushing out of the pagoda as fast as his legs could carry him, he soon escaped the third priest by mingling with the crowd in the streets. At 5 minutes before 8, Passepartout, hatless, shoeless, and having in the squabble lost his package of shirts and shoes, rushed breathlessly into the station. Fix, who had followed Mr. Fogg to the station and saw that he was really going to leave Bombay, was there upon the platform. He had resolved to follow the supposed robber to Calcutta, and further if necessary. Passepartout did not observe the detective, who stood in an obscure corner, but Fix heard him relate his adventures in a few words to Mr. Fogg. "I hope that this will not happen again," said Phileas Fogg coldly, as he got into the train. Poor Passepartout, quite crestfallen, followed his master without a word. Fix was on the point of entering another carriage when an idea struck him which induced him to alter his plans. "No, I'll stay," muttered he. "An offense has been committed on Indian soil. I've got my man." Just then the locomotive gave a sharp screech, and the train passed out into the darkness of the night. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11, in which Phileas Fogg secures a curious means of conveyance at a fabulous price. The train had started punctually. Among the passengers were a number of officers, government officials, and opium and indigo merchants, whose business called them to the eastern coast. Passepartout rode in the same carriage with his master, and a third passenger occupied a seat opposite to them. This was Sir Francis Cromarty, one of Mr. Fogg's whist partners on the Mongolia, now on his way to join his corps at Benares. Sir Francis was a tall, fair man of 50, who had greatly distinguished himself in the last Somme revolt. He made India his home, only paying brief visits to England at rare intervals, and was almost as familiar as a native with the customs, history, and character of India and its people. But Phileas Fogg, who was not travelling, but only describing a circumference, took no pains to inquire into these subjects. He was a solid body, traversing an orbit round the terrestrial globe. According to the laws of rational mechanics, he was at this moment calculating in his mind the number of hours spent since his departure from London, and had it been in his nature to make a useless demonstration, would have rubbed his hands for satisfaction. Sir Francis Cromarty had observed the oddity of his travelling companion, although the only opportunity he had for studying him had been while he was dealing the cards, and between two rubbers, and questioned himself whether a human heart really beat beneath this cold exterior, and whether Phileas Fogg had any sense of the beauties of nature. The Brigadier General was free to mentally confess that, of all the eccentric persons he had ever met, none was comparable to this product of the exact sciences. Phileas Fogg had not concealed from Sir Francis his design of going round the world, nor the circumstances under which he set out, and the General only saw in the wager a useless eccentricity, and a lack of sound common sense. In the way this strange gentleman was going on, he would leave the world without having done any good to himself or anybody else. An hour after leaving Bombay, the train had passed the viaducts and the island of Calcutta, and had gone into the open country at Kalyan. They reached the junction of the branch line which descends towards southeastern India by Kandala and Poona, and passing Powell, they entered the defiles of the mountains, with their basalt bases, and their summits crowned with thick and verdant forests. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty exchanged a few words from time to time, and now Sir Francis, reviving the conversation, observed, "Some years ago, Mr. Fogg, you would have met with a delay at this point which you probably have lost your wager." "How so, Sir Francis?" "Because the railway stopped at the base of these mountains, which the passengers were obliged to cross in palanquins, or on ponies to Kandala on the other side." "Such a delay would not have deranged my plans in the least," said Mr. Fogg. "I have constantly foreseen the likelihood of certain obstacles." "But, Mr. Fogg," pursued Sir Francis, "you run the risk of having some difficulties about this worthy fellow's adventure at the pagoda." Passepartout, his feet comfortably wrapped in his travelling blanket, was sound asleep, and did not dream that anybody was talking about him. "The government is very severe upon the kind of office. It takes particular care that the religious customs of Indians should be respected, and if your servant were caught—" "Very well, Sir Francis," replied Mr. Fogg. "If he had been caught, he would have been condemned and punished, and then would have quietly returned to Europe. I don't see how this affair could have delayed his master." The conversation fell again. During the night the train left the mountains behind, and passed Nasik, and the next day proceeded over the flat, well-cultivated country of the Khandish, with its staggering villages, above which rose the minarets of the pagodas. This fertile territory is watered by numerous small rivers and limpid streams, mostly tributaries of the Godavari. Passepartout, on waking and looking out, could not realize that he was actually crossing India in a railway train. The locomotive, guided by an English engineer, and fed with English coal, threw out its smoke upon cotton, coffee, nutmeg, clove, and pepper plantations, while the steam curled in spirals around a group of palm trees, in the midst of which were seen picturesque balgos, viharies, sort of abandoned monasteries, and marvelous temples, enriched by the exhaustless ornamentation of the Indian architecture. Then they came upon the vast tracts extending to the horizon, with jungles inhabited by snakes and tigers, which fled at the noise of train, succeeded by forest, penetrated by the railway, and still haunted by elephants, which, with pensive eyes, gazed at the train as it passed the travellers' cross. Beyond Millennium, the fatal country so often stained with blood by the sectaries of the goddess Kali, not far off rose Ellora, with its graceful pagodas, and the famous Aurangabad, capital of the ferocious Aurangzeb, now the chief town of one of the detached provinces of the kingdom of Nizam. It was thereabouts that Phrygia, the Thuggee chief, king of the Stranglers, held his sway. These ruffians, united by a secret bond, strangled victims of every age in honor of the goddess Death, without ever shedding blood. There was a period when this part of the country could scarcely be travelled over without corpses being found in every direction. The English government had succeeded in greatly diminishing these murders, though the Thuggees still existed, and pursued the exercise of their horrible rites. At 12:30 the train stopped at Burrahoopur, where Passepartout was able to purchase some Indian slippers, ornamented with false pearls, in which, with evident vanity, he proceeded to encase his feet. The travellers made a hasty breakfast, and started off for Assurghur, after skirting for a little the banks of the small river Tapati, which empties into the Gulf of Cambrai near Surat. Passepartout was now plunged into absorbing reverie. Up to his arrival at Bombay, he had entertained hopes that their journey would end there, but now that they were plainly whirling across India at full speed, a sudden change had come over the spirit of his dreams. His old vagabond nature returned to him. The fantastic ideas of his youth once more took possession of him. He came to regard his master's project as intended in good earnest, believed in the reality of the bet, and therefore in the tour of the world, and the necessity of making it without fail within the designated period. Already he began to worry about possible delays and accidents which might happen on the way. He recognized himself as being personally interested in the wager, and trembled at the thought that he might have been the means of losing it by his unpardonable folly of the night before. Being much less cool-headed than Mr. Fogg, he was much more restless, counting and recounting the days passed over, uttering maledictions when the train stopped, and accusing it of sluggishness and mentality, blaming Mr. Fogg for not having bribed the engineer. The worthy fellow was ignorant that, while it was possible by such means to hasten the rate of a steamer, it could not be done on the railway. The train entered the defiles of the Sutpur mountains, which separated the Khandish from Bunclod, towards evening. The next day Sir Francis Cromarty asked Passepartout what time it was, to which, on consulting his watch, he replied that it was 3 in the morning. This famous timepiece, always regulated on the Greenwich meridian, which was now 77 degrees westward, was at least 400 slow. Sir Francis corrected Passepartout's time, whereupon the latter made the strange remark that he had done to fix, and upon the general instance that the watch should be regulated in each new meridian, since he was constantly going eastward, that is in the face of the sun, and therefore the days were shorter by 4 minutes for each degree gone over. Passepartout obstinately refused to alter his watch, which he kept at London time. It was an innocent delusion which could harm no one. The train stopped at 8 o'clock in the midst of a glade some 15 miles beyond Roxel, where there were several bungalows and workmen's cabins. The conductor passed along the carriage, shouted, "Passengers will get out here!" Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty for an explanation, but the General could not tell what meant a halt in the midst of this forest of dates and assizes. Passepartout, not less surprised, rushed out and speedily returned, crying, "Monsieur, no more railway!" "What do you mean?" asked Sir Francis. "I mean to say that the train isn't going on." The General at once stepped out, while Phileas Fogg calmly followed him, and they proceeded together to the conductor. "Where are we?" asked Sir Francis. "At the hamlet of Colbay." "Do we stop here?" "Certainly. The railway isn't finished." "What! Not finished?" "No. There's still a matter of 50 miles to be laid from here to Allahabad, where the line begins again." "But the papers announced the opening of the railway throughout." "What would you have, officer? The papers were mistaken." "Yet you still take us from Bombay to Calcutta?" retorted Sir Francis, who was growing warm. "No doubt," replied the conductor, "but the passengers know that they must provide means of transportation for themselves from Colby to Allahabad." Sir Francis was furious. Passepartout would willingly have knocked the conductor down, and did not dare to look at his master. "Sir Francis," said Mr. Fogg quietly, "we will, if you please, look about for some means of conveyance to Allahabad." "Mr. Fogg, this is dealing greatly to your disadvantage." "No, Sir Francis, it was foreseen." "What! You knew that the way—" "Not at all. But I knew that some obstacle or other would sooner or later arise on my route. Nothing, therefore, is lost. I have 2 days, which I have already gained, to sacrifice. A steamer leaves Calcutta for Hong Kong at noon on the 25th. This is the 22nd, and we shall reach Calcutta in time." There was nothing to say so confident a response. It was but too true that the railway came to a termination at this point. The papers were like some watches which have a way of getting too fast, and had been premature in their announcement of the completion of the line. The greater part of the travellers were aware of this interpretation, and leaving the train, they began to engage such vehicles as the village could provide: 4-wheeled palkingers, wagons drawn by zebras, carriages that looked like perambulas, pagodas, palanquins, ponies, and what not. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, after searching the village from end to end, came back without having found anything. "I shall go afoot," said Phileas Fogg. Passepartout, who had now rejoined his master, made a wry grimace as he thought of his magnificent but too frail Indian shoes. Happily he too had been looking about him, and after a moment hastened, said, "Monsieur, I think I have found a means of conveyance." "What?" "An elephant! An elephant that belongs to the Indian who lives but 100 steps from here." "Let's go and see the elephant," replied Mr. Fogg. They soon reached a small hut, near which, enclosed within some high palings, was the animal in question. An Indian came out of the hut, and at their request conducted them within the enclosure. The elephant, which its owners had reared not for a beast of burden, but for warlike purposes, was half domesticated. The Indian had begun already, by often irritating him, and feeding him every 3 months on sugar and butter, to impart to him a ferocity not in his nature. this method being often employed by those who train the Indian elephants for battle. Happily, however, for Mr. Fogg, the animal's instructions in this direction had not gone far, and the elephant still preserved his natural gentleness. Kiani, this was the name of the beast, could doubtless travel rapidly for a long time, and, in default of any other means of conveyance, Mr. Fogg resolved to hire him. But elephants are far from cheap in India, where they are becoming scarce, and males which alone are suitable for circus shows, and more sought especially, as but a few of them are domesticated. When therefore Mr. Fogg proposed to the Indian to hire Kiani, he refused point blank. Mr. Fogg persisted, offering the excessive sum of £10 an hour for the loan of the beast to Allahabad. Refused £20, refused also £40, still refused. Passepartout jumped at each advance, but the Indian declined to be tempted. Yet the offer was an alluring one, for supposing it took the elephant 15 hours to reach Allahabad, his owner would receive no less than £600 sterling. Phileas Fogg, without getting in the least flurried, then proposed to purchase the animal outright, at the first offering £1,000 for him. The Indian, perhaps thinking he was going to make a great bargain, still refused. Sir Francis Cromarty took Mr. Fogg aside, and begged him to reflect before he went any further, to which that gentleman replied that he was not in the habit of acting rashly, that a bet of £20,000 was at stake, that the elephant was absolutely necessary to him, and that he would secure him if he had to pay 20 times his value. Returning to the Indian, whose small sharp eyes, glistening with avarice, betrayed that with him it was only a question of how great a price he could obtain, Mr. Fogg offered first 1,200, and then 1,500, 1,800, 2,000 pounds. Passepartout, usually so rubicund, was fairly white with suspense. At 2,000 pounds the Indian yielded. "What a price, good heavens!" cried Passepartout, "for an elephant!" It only remained now to find a guide, which was comparatively easy. A young Parsee with an intelligent face offered his services, which Mr. Fogg accepted, promising so generous a reward as to materially stimulate his zeal. The elephant was led out and equipped. The Parsee, who was an accomplished elephant driver, covered his back with a sort of saddle cloth, and attached to each of his flanks some curiously uncomfortable howdahs. Phileas Fogg paid the Indian with some banknotes, which he extracted from the famous carpet-bag, a proceeding that seemed to deprive the poor Passepartout of his vitals. Then he offered to carry Sir Francis to Allahabad, which the brigadier gratefully accepted. As one of the travellers, the more would not be likely to fatigue the gigantic beast. Provisions were purchased at Colby, and while Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg took the howdahs on either side, Passepartout got astride the saddle-cloth between them. The Parsee perched himself on the elephant's neck, and at 9 o'clock they set out from the village, the animal marching off through the dense forest of palms by the shortest cut. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 11, in which Phileas Fogg and his companions venture across the Indian forests, and what ensued. In order to shorten the journey, the guide passed to the left of the line where the railway was still in process of being built. This line, owing to the capricious turnings of the Vindhya mountains, did not pursue a straight course. The Parsee, who was quite familiar with the roads and paths in this district,
declared that they would gain 20 miles by striking directly through the forest. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty plunged to the neck in the peculiar howdahs provided for them, were horribly jostled by the swift trotting of the elephant, spurred on as he was by the skilful palsy, but they endured discomfort with true British phlegm, talking little and scarcely able to catch a glimpse of each other. As for Passepartout, who was mounted on the beast's back and received direct force of each conscious as he trod along, he was very careful, in accordance with his master's advice, to keep his tongue from between his teeth, as it would otherwise have been bitten off short. The worthy fellow bounced from the elephant's neck to his rump, and vultured like a clown on a spring-board. Yet he laughed in the midst of his bouncing, and from time to time took a piece of sugar out of his pocket and inserted it into Quaney's trunk, who received it without in the least slacking his regular trot. After 2 hours the guide stopped the elephant, and gave him an hour for rest, during which Quaney, after quenching his thirst at a neighbouring spring, set to devour the branches and scrubs round about him. Neither Sir Francis nor Mr. Fogg regretted the delay, and both dissented with a feeling of relief. "Why, he's made of iron!" exclaimed the General, gazing admiringly on Quaney. "Or forged iron," replied Passepartout, as he set about preparing a hasty breakfast. At noon the Pharisee gave the signal of departure. The country soon presented a very savage aspect. Copses of dates and dwarf palms succeeded the dense forest, then vast dry plains dotted with scanty shrubs and sown with great blocks of sienite. All this portion of Bundelcut, which is little frequented by travellers, is inhabited by a fanatical population, hardened in the most horrible practices of the Hindu faith. The English have not been able to secure complete dominance over this territory, which is subject to the influence of Rajas, whom it is most impossible to reach in their inaccessible mountain fastnesses. The travellers several times saw bands of furious Indians, who, when they perceived the elephant striding across country, made angry and threatening motions. The Pharisee avoided them as much as possible. Few animals were observed on the routes. Even the monkeys hurried from their path with contortions and grimaces, with convulsed Passepartout with laughter. In the midst of his gaiety, however, one thought troubled the worthy servant. What would Mr. Fogg do with the elephant when he got to Allahabad? Would he carry him on with him? Impossible! The cost of transporting him would make him ruinously expensive. Would he sell him, or set him free? The estimable beast certainly deserved some consideration. Should Mr. Fogg choose to make him, Passepartout, a present of Quaney, he would be very much embarrassed, and these thoughts did not cease worrying him for a long time. The principal chain of the Vindes was crossed by 8 in the evening, and another halt was made on the northern slope in the ruined bungalow. They had gone nearly 25 miles that day, and an equal distance still separated them from the station of Allahabad. The night was cold. The Pharisee lit a fire in the bungalow with a few dry branches, and the warmth was very grateful. Provisions purchased at Colby sufficed for supper, and the travellers ate ravenously, the conversation beginning with a few disconnected phrases soon gave place to loud and steady snores. The guide watched Quani, who slept standing, bolstering himself against the trunk of a large tree. Nothing occurred during the night to disturb these slumbers, although occasionally growls, front panthers, and chatterings of monkeys broke the silence, and more formidable beasts made no cries or hostile demonstrating against the occupants of the bungalow. So Francis slept heavily, like an honest soldier overcome with fatigue. Passepartout was wrapped in uneasy dreams of the bouncing of the day before. As for Mr. Fogg, he slumbered as peacefully as if he had been in his serried mansion in Savile Row. The journey was resumed at 6 in the morning. The guide hoped to reach Allahabad by evening. In that case, Mr. Fogg would only lose part of the 48 hours saved since the beginning of the tour. Quani, resuming his rapid gait, soon descended the lower spurs of Iwani, and towards noon they passed by the village of Cullinger on the Khani, one of the branches of the Ganges. The guide avoided inhabited places, thinking it safer to keep the open country which lies along the first depressions of the basin of the great river. Allahabad was now only 12 miles to the northeast. They stopped under a clump of bananas, the fruit of which, as healthy as a bread and as succulent as cream, was amply partaken of and appreciated. At 2 o'clock the guide entered a thick forest, which extended several miles. He preferred to travel under cover of the woods. They had not as yet had any unpleasant encounters, and the journey seemed on the point of being successfully accomplished, when the elephant, becoming restless, suddenly stopped. It was then 4 o'clock. "What's the matter?" asked Sir Francis, putting out his head. "I don't know, officer," replied the Parsee, listening attentively to the confused murmur which came through the thick branches. The murmur soon became more distinct. It now seemed like a distant concert of human voices, accompanied by brass instruments. Passepartout was all eyes and ears. Mr. Fogg patiently waited without a word. The Pharisee jumped to the ground, fastened the elephant to a tree, and plunged into the thicket. He soon returned, saying, "A procession of Brahmins is coming this way. We must prevent their seeing us, if possible." The guide unloosed the elephant and led him into a thicket, at the same time asking the travellers not to stir. He held himself ready to bestride the animal at a moment's notice. Shoulder flight became necessary, but he eventually thought that the procession of the faithful would pass without perceiving them amid the thicket foliage, in which they were wholly concealed. The discordant tones of the voices and instruments drew near, and now droning the songs mingled with the sound of tambourines and cymbals. The head of the procession soon appeared beneath the trees, 100 paces away, and the strange figures who performed the religious ceremony were easily distinguished through the branches. First came the priests with mitres on their heads, and clothed in long robes. They were surrounded by men, women, and children, who sang a kind of lugubrious psalm, interrupted at regular intervals by the tambourines and cymbals, while behind him was drawn a cart with large wheels, the spokes of which represented serpents entwined with each other. Upon the car, which was drawn by 4 richly caparisoned zebus, stood a hideous statue with 4 arms, a body calmed, a dull red with haggard eyes, dishevelled hair, protruding tongue, and lips tinted with betel. It stood upright upon the figure of a prostrate and headless giant. Sir Francis recognized the statue, whispering, "The goddess Kai, the goddess of love and death." "Of death, perhaps," muttered back Passepartout, "but of love, the ugly old hag, never." The Pharisee made a motion to keep silent. A group of old fakirs were caparting making a wild ado round the statue. These were striped with ochre and covered with cuts whence their blood issued drop by drop. Stupid fanatics, who, in the great Indian ceremonies, still throw themselves under the wheels of Juggernaut. Some Brahms, clad in all sumptuousness of Oriental apparel, and leading a woman who faltered at every step, followed. This woman was young and as fair as European. Her head and neck, shoulders, ears, arms, hands, and toes were loaded down with jewels and gems, with bracelets, earrings, and rings, while a tunic bordered with gold, covered with a light muslin robe, betrayed the outline of her form. The guards who followed the young woman presented a violent contrast to her, armed as they were with naked sabres hung to the waists, and long domestic pistols, and bearing a corpse on a palanquin. It was the body of an old man, gorgeously arrayed in the habiliments of a Rajah, wearing, as in life, a turban embroidered with pearls, a robe of tissue, of silk and gold, a scarf of cashmere sewed with diamonds, and the magnificent weapons of a Hindu prince. Next came the musicians, and a rearguard of capering fakirs, whose cries sometimes drowned the noise of the instruments. These closed the processions. Sir Francis watched the procession with a sad countenance, and turning to the guide, said, "A suttee." The Parisian nodded, and put his finger to his lips. The procession slowly wound under the trees, and soon its last ranks disappeared in the depths of the wood. The songs gradually died away. Occasional cries were heard in the distance, until at last all was silence again. Phileas Fogg had heard what Sir Francis said, and as soon as the procession had disappeared, asked, "What is a suttee?" "A suttee," returned the General, "is a human sacrifice, but a voluntary one. The woman you have just seen will be burned tomorrow at the dawn of day." "Oh, the scoundrels!" cried Passepartout, who could not repress his indignation. "And the corpse?" asked Mr. Fogg. "Is that of the Prince, her husband," said the guide, "an independent Rajah of Bundelkund." "Is it possible," resumed Mr. Fogg, his voice betraying not the least emotion, "that these barbarous customs still exist in India, and that the English have been unable to put a stop to them?" "These sacrifices do not occur in the larger portion of India," replied Sir Francis, "but we have no power over these savage territories, and especially here in Bundelkund. The whole district north of the Vindhyas is the theatre of incessant murders and pillage." "The poor wretch!" exclaimed Passepartout. "To be burned alive?" "Yes," returned Sir Francis, "burned alive; and if she were not, you cannot conceive what treatment she would be obliged to submit to from her relatives. They would shave off her hair, feed her on a scanty allowance of rice, treat her with contempt, she would be looked upon as an unclean creature, and would die in some corner, like a scurvy dog. The prospect of so frightful an existence drives these poor creatures to the sacrifice, much more than love or religion fanaticism. Sometimes, however, the sacrifice is really voluntary, and it requires the active interference of the government to prevent it. Several years ago, when I was living at Bombay, a young widow asked permission of the government to be burned along with her husband's body, but, as you may imagine, he refused. The woman left the town, took refuge with an independent Raja, and there carried out her self-devoted purpose. While Sir Francis was speaking, the guide shook his head several times, and now said, "The sacrifices which will take place tomorrow at dawn is not a voluntary one." "How do you know?" "Everybody knows about this affair in Bwanda." "But the wretched creature did not seem to be making any resistance," observed Sir Francis. "This was because they had intoxicated her with fumes of hemp and opium." "But where are they taking her?" "To the pagoda of Phileas. 2 miles from here. She will pass the night there, and the sacrifice will take place tomorrow at the first light of dawn." The guide now led the elephant out of the thicket, and leapt upon his neck. Just at the moment that he was about to urge Quani forward with a peculiar whistle, Mr. Fogg stopped him, and turned to Sir Francis Cromarty, and said, "Suppose we save this woman." "Save the woman, Mr. Fogg? I've yet 12 hours to spare. I can devote them to that." "Why, you are a man of heart." "Sometimes," replied Phileas Fogg quietly, "when I have the time." End of chapter 12. Chapter 13, in which Passepartout receives a new proof that fortune favors the brave. The project was a bold one, full of difficulty, perhaps impracticable. Mr. Fogg was going to risk life, or at least liberty, and therefore the success of his tour. But he did not hesitate, and he found in Sir Francis Cromarty an enthusiastic ally. As for Passepartout, he was ready for anything that might be proposed. His master's idea charmed him. He perceived a heart, a soul under that icy exterior. He began to love Phileas Fogg. There remained the guide. What course would he adopt? Would he not take part with the Indians, in default of his assistance? It was necessary to be assured of his neutrality. Sir Francis frankly put the question to him. "Officers," replied the guide, "I am a Parsee, and that woman is a Parsee. Command me as you will." "Excellent," said Mr. Fogg. "However," resumed the guide, "it is certain not only that we should risk our lives, but horrible torture, if we are taken." "This is foreseen," replied Mr. Fogg. "I think we must wait till night before acting." "I think so," said the guide. The worthy Indian gave some account of the victim, who, he said, was a celebrated beauty of the Parsee race, and that daughter of a wealthy Bombay merchant. She had received a thoroughly English education in that city, and from her manners and intelligence would be thought an European. Her name was Iota. Left an orphan, she was married against her will to the old Raja of Bundklad, and knowing the fate that awaited her, she escaped, was retaken, and devoted by the Raja's relatives, who had an interest in her death, the sacrifice from which it seemed she could not escape. The Parsee's narrative only confirmed Mr. Fogg and his companions in their genuine design. It was decided that the guide should direct the elephant towards the pagoda of Pelagia, which he accordingly approached as quickly as possible. They halted half an hour afterwards in a copse some 500 feet from the pagoda, where they were well concealed, but they could not hear the groans and cries of the fakirs distinctly. They then discussed the means of getting at the victim. The guide was familiar with the pagoda of Phileas, in which, as he declared, the young woman was imprisoned. Could they enter any of its doors while its whole party of Indians was plunged into the darkness sleep, or would it safer to attempt to make a hole in the wall? This could only be determined at the moment and the place themselves, but it was certain that the abduction must be made that night, and not when at break of day the victim was led to her funeral pyre. Then no human intervention could save her. As soon as night fell, about 6 o'clock, they decided to make a reconnaissance around the pagoda. The cries of the fakirs were just ceasing. The Indians were in the act of plunging themselves into the drunkenness caused by liquid opium mingled with hemp, and it might be possible to slip between them to the temple itself. The Parsee, leading the others, noiselessly crept through the wood, and in 10 minutes they found themselves on the bank of a small stream, whence, by the light of rosin torches, they perceived a pyre of wood, on the top of which lay the embalmed body of the Rajah, which was to be burned with his wife. The pagoda, whose minarets loomed above the trees in the deepening dusk, stood 100 steps away. "Come," whispered the guide. He slipped more cautiously than ever through the bush, followed by his companions. The silence around was only broken by the low murmuring of the wind among the branches. Soon the Parsee stopped on the borders of the glade, which was lit up by the torches. The ground was covered by groups of the Indians, motionless in their drunken sleep. It seemed to a battlefield strewn with the dead. Men, women, and children lay together. In the background, among the trees, the pagoda of Phileas loomed distinctly, much to the guide's disappointment. The guards of the Rajah, lighted by torches, were watching at the doors, and marching to and fro with naked soubrettes. Probably the priests, too, were watching within. The Parsee, now convinced that it was impossible to force an entrance to the temple, advanced no further, but led his companions back again. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty also saw that nothing could be attempted in that direction. They stopped and engaged in a whisper colloquy. "It is only 8 now," said the brigadier, "and these guards may also go to sleep." "It is not impossible," returned the Parsee. They lay down at the foot of the tree. He waited. The time seemed long. The guide ever and anon left them to take an observation on the edge of the wood, but the guards watched steadily by the glare of the torches, and a dim light crept through the windows of the pagoda. They waited till midnight, but no change took place among the guards, and it became apparent that their yielding to sleep could not be counted on. The other plan must be carried out. An opening in the walls of the pagoda must be made. It remained to ascertain whether the priests were watching by the side of their victim as assiduously as were the soldiers at the door. After the last consultation, the guide announced that he was ready for the attempt, and advancing, followed by the others, they took a roundabout way, so as to get to the pagoda on the rear.
They reached the walls about 12:30 without having met anyone. Here there was no guard, nor were there either windows or door. The night was dark. The moon on the wane scarcely left the horizon, and was covered with heavy clouds. The height of the trees deepened the darkness. It was not enough to reach the walls. An opening in them must be accomplished, and to attain this purpose the party only had their pocket knives. Happily the temple walls were built of brick and wood, which could be penetrated with little difficulty, and after one brick had been taken out the rest would yield easily. They set noiselessly to work, and the Parsi on one side and Passepartout on the other began to loosen the bricks, so as to make an aperture 2 feet wide. They were getting on rapidly when suddenly a cry was heard in the interior of the temple, followed almost instantly by other cries replying from the outside. Passepartout and the guide stopped. Had they been heard? Was the alarm given? Common prudence urged them to retire, and they did so, followed by Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis. They again hid themselves in the wood, and waited till the disturbance, whatever it might be, ceased, holding themselves ready to resume their attempt without delay. But, awkwardly enough, the guards now appeared at the rear of the temple, and there installed themselves in readiness to prevent a surprise. It would be difficult to describe the disappointment of the party, thus interrupted in their work. They could not now reach the victim. How, then, could they save her? Sir Francis shook his fists. Passepartout was beside himself, and the guide gnashed his teeth with rage. The tranquil Fogg waited without betraying any emotion. "We have nothing to do but to go away," whispered Sir Francis. "Nothing but to go away," echoed the guide. "Stop," said Fogg. "I'm only due at Allahabad tomorrow before noon." "But what can you hope to do?" said Sir Francis. "In a few hours it will be daylight, and the change which now seems lost may present itself at the last moment." Sir Francis would have liked to read Phileas Fogg's eyes. What was this cool Englishman thinking of? Was he planning to make a rush for the young woman at the very moment of the sacrifice, and boldly snatch her from her executioners? This would be utter folly, and it was hard to admit that Fogg was such a fool. Sir Francis consented, however, to remain to the end of this terrible drama. The guide led them up to rear of the glade, where they were able to observe the sleeping groups. Meanwhile Passepartout, who had perched himself on the lower branches of the trees, was resolving an idea which had at first struck him like a flash, and which was now firmly lodged in his brain. He had commenced by saying to himself, "What folly!" and then he repeated, "Why not, after all? It's a chance, perhaps, the only one." And with such thoughts, thinking thus, he slipped with the suppleness of a serpent to the lowest branches, the ends of which bent almost to the ground. The hours passed, and the lighter shades now announced the approach of day, though it was not yet light. This was the moment the slumbering multitude became animated. The tambourine sounded, songs and cries arose. The hour of the sacrifice had come. The doors of the pagoda swung open, and the bright light escaped from its interior, in the midst of which Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis espied the victim. She seemed, having shaken off the stupor of intoxication, to be striving to escape from her executioner. Sir Francis' heart throbbed, and convulsively seizing Mr. Fogg's hand, found
in it an open knife. Just as this moment the crowd began to move. This young woman had again fallen into a stupor caused by the fumes of hemp, and passed among the fakirs, who escorted her with their wild religious cries. Phileas Fogg and his companions mingled in the rear ranks of the crowd, followed, and in 2 minutes they reached the banks of the stream, and stopped 50 paces from the pyre, upon which still lay the Rajah's corpse. In the semi-obscurity they saw the victim quite senseless, stretched out beside her husband's body. Then a torch was brought, and the wood, heavily soaked with oil, instantly took fire. At this moment Sir Francis and the guide seized Phileas Fogg, who, in an instinct of mad generosity, was about to rush upon the pyre, but he had quickly pushed them aside, when the whole scene suddenly changed. A cry of terror arose. The whole multitude prostrated themselves, terror-stricken, on the ground. The old Rajah was not dead. Then, since he arose of a sudden, like a spectre, took up his wife in his arms, and descended from the pyre in the midst of clouds of smoke, which only heightened his ghostly appearance. Fakirs and soldiers and priests, seized with instant terror, lay there with their faces on the ground, not daring to lift their eyes and behold such a prodigy. The inanimate victim was borne along by the vigorous arms which supported her, and which she did not seem in the least to burden. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis stood erect. The Parsi bowed his head, and Passepartout was, no doubt, scarcely less stupefied. The resuscitated Rajah approached Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg, and in an abrupt tone said, "Let us be off." It was Passepartout himself, who had slipped upon the pyre in the midst of the smoke, profited by the still overhanging darkness, had delivered the young woman from death. It was Passepartout who, playing his part with a happy audacity, had passed through the crowd amid the general terror. A moment after all 4 of the party had disappeared in the woods, an elephant was bearing them away at a rapid pace, but the cries and noise and a ball which whizzed through Phileas Fogg's hat apprised them that the trick had been discovered. The old Rajah's body indeed now appeared upon the burning pyre, and the priests, recovered from their terror, perceived that an abduction had taken place. They hastened into the forest, followed by the soldiers, who fired a volley after the fugitives, but the latter rapidly increased the distance between them, and ere long found themselves beyond the reach of the bullets and arrows. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14, in which Phileas Fogg descends the whole length of the beautiful valley of the Ganges without ever thinking of seeing it. The rash exploit had been accomplished, and for an hour Passepartout laughed gaily at his successes. Sir Francis pressed the worthy fellow's hand, and his master said, "Well done," which from him was high commendation, at which Passepartout replied that all the credit of the affair belonged to Mr. Fogg. As for him, he had only been struck with a queer idea, and he laughed to think that for a few moments he, Passepartout, the ex-gymnast, ex-surgeon, Firmin, had been the spouse of a charming woman, a venerable, embalmed Rajah. As for the young Indian woman, she had been unconscious throughout of what was passing, and now, wrapped up in a travelling blanket, was reposing in one of the howdahs. The elephant, thanks to the skilful guidance of the Percy was advancing rapidly through the still darksome forest, and an hour after leaving the pagoda had crossed a vast plain. They made a halt at 7 o'clock, the young woman being still in a state of complete prostration. The guide made her drink a little brandy and water, but the drowsiness which stupefied her could not yet be shaken off. Sir Francis, who was familiar with the effects of the intoxication produced by the fumes of hemp, reassured his companions on her account, but he was more disturbed at the prospect of her future fate. He told Phileas Fogg that, should Aouda remain in India, she would invariably fall again into the hands of her executioners. These fanatics were scattered throughout the country, and would, despite the English policy, recover their victim at Madras, Bombay, or Calcutta. She would only be safe by quitting India forever. Phileas Fogg replied that he would reflect upon the matter. The station at Allahabad was reached at about 10 o'clock, and the interrupted line of railway being resumed, would enable them to reach Calcutta in less than 24 hours. Phileas Fogg would thus be able to arrive in time to take the steamer which left Calcutta the next day, October 25th at noon, for Hong Kong. The young woman was placed in one of the waiting rooms of the station, whilst Passepartout was charged with purchasing for her various articles of toilette, a dress, shawl, and some furs, for which his master gave him unlimited credit. Passepartout started off forthwith, and found himself in the streets of Allahabad, that is, the city of God, one of the most venerated in India, being built at the junction of the two sacred rivers, Ganges and Jumna, the waters of which attract pilgrims from every part of the peninsula. The Ganges, according to the legends of the Ramayana, rises in heaven, whence, owing to Brahma's agency, it descends to earth. Passepartout made it a point, as he made his purchases, to take a good look at the city. It was formerly defended by a noble fort, which has since become a state prison. Its commerce has dwindled away, and Passepartout in vain looked about him for such a bazaar as he used to frequent in Regent Street. At least he came upon an elderly, crusty Jew, who sold second-hand articles, and from whom he purchased a dress of Scotch stuff, a large mantle, and fine otter-skin pelisse, for which he did not hassle to pay £75. He then returned triumphantly to the station. The influence to which the priest of Pelagie had subjected Aouda began gradually to yield, and she became more herself, so that her fine eyes resumed all their soft Indian expression. When the poet king Ukaf Udal celebrated the charms of the queen of Almehegre, he speaks thus: her shining tresses, divided in two parts, encircled the harmonious counter of her white and delicious cheeks, brilliant in their glow and freshness. Her abode brings how the form and charm of the bow of Kama, the god of love, and beneath her long silken lashes the Proust reflections and a celestial light swim as the sacred lakes of Himalaya in the black pupils of her great clear eyes. Her teeth, fine, equal, and white, glittered between her smiling lips like dewdrops, and a passion flowers half enveloped breast. Her delicately formed ears, her vermilion hands, her little feet, carved and tender as the lotus bud, glitter with the brilliancy of the loveliest pearls of Ceylon, the most dazzling diamonds of Calcutta, her narrow and supple waist, which a hand may clasp around, sets forth the outlines of her rounded figure and the beauty of her bosom, which youth in its flowers displays the wealth of its treasures. And beneath the silken folds of her tunic she seems to have been modelled in pure silver by the godlike hand of Vikvarkama, the immortal sculptor. It is enough to say, without applying this poetic rhapsody to Aoda, that she was a charming woman in all the European acceptation of the phrase. She spoke English with great purity, and the guide had not exaggerated in saying that the young Parsi had been transformed by her bringing up. The train was about to start from Allahabad, and Mr. Fogg proceeded to pay the guide the price agreed upon for his service, and not a farthing more, which astonished Passepartout, who remembered all that his master owed to the guide's devotion. He had indeed risked his life in the adventure of Pija, and if he should be caught afterwards by the Indians, he would with difficulty escape their vengeance. Quani also must be disposed of. What should be done with the elephant, which had been so dearly purchased? Phileas Fogg had already determined this question. Parsi, said he to the guide, you have been serviceable and devoted. I have paid you for your service, but not for your devotion. Would you like to have this elephant? He is yours. The guide's eyes glistened. Your honour is giving me a fortune, cried he. Take him, guide, returned Mr. Fogg, and I shall still be your debtor. Good, exclaimed Passepartout. Take him, friend. Quani is a brave and faithful beast. And going up to the elephant, he gave him several lumps of sugar, saying, Here, Quani, here, here. The elephant grunted out his satisfaction, and clasping Passepartout around the waist with his trunk, lifted him as high as his head. Passepartout, not in the least alarmed, caressed the animal, which replaced him gently on the ground. Soon after, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, installed in a carriage with Aouda, who had the best seat, were whirling at full speed towards Benares. It was a run of 80 miles, and was accomplished in 2 hours. During the journey the young woman fully recovered her senses. What was her astonishment to find herself in this carriage on the railway, dressed in European habiliments, and with travellers who were quite strangers to her. Her companions first set about fully recovering her with a little liquor, and then Sir Francis narrated to her what had passed, dwelling upon the courage with which Phileas Fogg had not hastened to risk his life to save her, and recounting that happy sequel of the venture that resulted of Passepartout's rash idea. Mr. Fogg said nothing, while Passepartout, abashed, kept repeating that it wasn't worth telling. Aouda pathetically thanked her deliverers, rather with tears than words. Her fine eyes interpreted her gratitude better than her lips. Then, as her thoughts strayed back to the scene of the sacrifice, and recalled the dangers which still menaced her, she shuddered with terror. Phileas Fogg understood what was passing in Aouda's mind, and offered, in order to reassure her, to escort her to Hong Kong, where she might remain safely until the affair was hushed up, an offer which she eagerly and gratefully accepted. She had, it seems, a Parsi relation, who was one of the principal merchants of Hong Kong, which is wholly an English city, though on an island on the Chinese coast. At 12:30 the train stopped at Benares. The Brahmin legends asserted that this city is built on the site of the ancient Kasi, which, like Mahomet's tomb, was once suspended between heaven and earth, though the Benares of today, which the Orientalists call the Athens of India, stands quite unpoetically on the solid earth. Passepartout caught glimpses of its brick houses and clay huts, giving an aspect of desolation to the place as the train entered it. Benares was Sir Francis Cromarty's destination, the troops he was rejoining being encamped some miles northward of the city. He bade adieu to Phileas Fogg, wishing him all success, and expressing the hope that he would come that way again, in less original but more profitable fashion. Mr. Fogg lightly pressed him by the hand. The parting of Ada, who did not forget what she owed to Sir Francis, betrayed more warmth, and as for Passepartout, he received a hearty shake of the hand from the gallant general. The railway, on leaving Benares, passed for a while along the valley of Ganges. Throughout the window of the carriage the traveller had glimpses of the diversified landscape of Bahar, which, its mountains clothed in verdure, its fields of barley, wheat, and corn, its jungles peopled with green alligators, its neat villages, and its still thicky-leaved forests. Elephants were bathing in the waters of the sacred river, and groups of Indians, despite advanced sessions and chilly air, were performing solemnly their poyas ablutions. These were fervent Brahmins, the bitterest foes of Buddhism, their deities being Vishnu, the solar god, Shiva, and divine impersonation of natural forces, and Brahma, the supreme ruler of priests and legislators. What would these divinities think of India, Anglicist as it is today, with steamers, whistles, and scooting along the Ganges, frightened the gulls which float upon its surface, the turtles swimming along its banks, and the faithful dwelling upon its borders? The panorama passed before their eyes like a flash, save when the steam concealed it fully from view. The travellers could scarcely discern the fort of Trupani 20 miles south-westward from Benares, the ancient stronghold of the Rajas of Mahor, of Gazipur and its famous rosewater factories, or the tomb of Lord Cornwallis rising on the left bank of the Ganges. The fortified town of Buxar and Panta, a large manufacturing and trading place, where is held the principal opium market of India. On Mulgar, a more than European town, for it is English as much as of bringers, with its iron foundries, agricultural factories, and high chimneys putting clouds of black smoke heavenward. Night came on. The train passed on at full speed in the midst of the roaring of the tigers, bears, and wolves, which fled before the locomotive, and the marvels of Bengal, Golconda, Runingore, Moorshedabad, the ancient capital Bardwin, Hooghly, and the French town of Chandigarh, where Passepartout would have been proud to see his country's flag flying, were hidden from view in the darkness. Calcutta was reached at 7 in the morning, and the packet left for Hong Kong at noon, so that Phileas Fogg had 5 hours before him. According to this journal, he was due at Calcutta on the 25th of October, and that was the exact date of his actual arrival. He was therefore neither behindhand nor ahead of time. The 2 days gained between London and Bombay had been lost, as has been seen, in the journey across India. But it is not to be surprised that Phileas Fogg regretted them. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15, in which the bag of banknotes disgorges some thousands of pounds more. The train entered the station, and Passepartout jumped out first, was followed by Mr. Fogg, who assisted his fair companion to descent. Phileas Fogg intended to proceed at once to the Hong Kong steamer, in order to get Aouda comfortably settled for the voyage. He was unwilling to leave her while they were still on dangerous ground. Just as he was leaving the station, a policeman came up to him and said, "Mr. Phileas Fogg?" "I am he." "Is this man your servant?" asked the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. "Yes." "Be so good, both of you, as to follow me." Mr. Fogg betrayed no surprise whatever. The policeman was a representative of the law, and law is sacred to an Englishman. Passepartout tried to reason about the matter, but the policeman tapped him with his stick, and Mr. Fogg made him a signal to obey. "May this young lady go with us?" asked he. "She may," replied the policeman. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout were conducting to a pilkigre, a sort of four-wheeled carriage drawn by two horses, in which they took their places and were driven away. No one spoke during the 20 minutes which elapsed before they reached their destination. The first passage through the black town, with its narrow streets, its miserable dirty huts, and squalid population, that then through the European town, which presented a relief in its bright brick mansions, shaded by coconut trees and bristling with masts, where, although it was early morning, elegantly dressed horsemen and handsome equipages were passing back and forth. The carriage stopped before a modest-looking house, which, however, did not have the appearance of a private mansion. The policeman, having requested his persons for so truly they might be called to descend, conducted them into a room with barred windows, and said, "You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30. He then retired and closed the door. "Why are we prisoners?" exclaimed Passepartout, falling into a chair. Aouda, with an emotion she tried to conceal, said to Mr. Fogg, "Sir, you must leave me to my fate. It is on my account that you receive this treatment. It is for having saved me." Phileas Fogg contented himself with saying that it was impossible. It was quite unlikely that he should be arrested for preventing a sortie. The complainants would not dare present themselves with such a charge. There was some mistake. Moreover, he would not in any event abandon Aouda, but would escort her to Hong Kong. "But the steamer leaves at noon," observed Passepartout nervously. "We shall be on board by noon," replied his master placidly. It was said so positively that Passepartout could not help muttering to himself, "Parbleu, that's certain. Before noon we should be on board." But he was by no means reassured. At 8:30 the door opened. The policeman appeared and requested them to follow him, led the way to an adjoining hall. It was evidently a court-room, and a crowd of Europeans and natives already occupied the rear of the apartment. Mr. Fogg and his two companions took their place on a bench opposite the desks of the magistrate and his clerk. Immediately after, Judge Obadiah, a fat, round man, followed by the clerk, entered. He proceeded to take down a wig which was hanging on a nail, and put it hurriedly on his head. "The first case," said he. Then putting his hand to his head, he examined. "Heh! This is not my wig." "No, your worship," returned the clerk, "it is mine." "My dear Mr. Oysterpoof, How can a judge give a wise sentence in a clerk's wig?" The wigs were exchanged. Passepartout was getting nervous, for the hands on the face of the big clock over the judge seemed to go around with terrible rapidity. "The first case," repeated the judge. "Odiaha." "Phileas Fogg," demanded Osterpuff. "I'm here," replied Mr. Fogg. "Passepartout?" "Present," responded Passepartout. "Good," said the judge. "You have been looked for, prisoners, for 2 days on the trains from Bombay." "But of what are we accused?" asked Passepartout impatiently. "You're about to be informed." "I'm an English subject, sir," said Mr. Fogg, "and I have the right—" "Have you been ill-treated?" "Not at all." "Very well. Let the complaints come in." A door was swung open by order of the judge, and 3 Indian priests entered. "That's it," muttered Passepartout. "There are the rogues who were going to burn our young lady." The priests took their places in front of the judge, and the clerk proceeded to read in a loud voice a complaint of sacrilege against Phileas Fogg and his servant, who were accused of having violated a place held consecrated by the Brahmin religion. "You bear the charge?" asked the judge. "Yes, sir," replied Mr. Fogg, consulting his watch, "and I admit it." "You admit it?" "I admit it, and I wish to hear these priests admit, in their turn, what they were going to do at the pagoda of Phileas." The priests looked at each other. They did not seem to understand what was said. "Yes," cried Passepartout warmly, "at the pagoda of Phileas, where they were on the point of burning their victim." The judge started with astonishment, and the priests were stupefied. "What victim?" said Judge Obadiah. "Burn whom? In Bombay itself?" "Bombay?" cried Passepartout. "Certainly. We are not talking of the pagoda of Phileas, but of the pagoda of Malabar Hill at Bombay." "And as a proof," added the clerk, "here are the desecrator's very shoes, which he left behind him." Whereupon he placed a pair of shoes on his desk. "My shoes!" cried Passepartout, in his surprise, permitting this imprudent exclamation to escape him. The confession of master and man, who had quite forgotten the affair at Bombay, for which they were not detained at Calcutta, may be imagined. Fix, the detective, had foreseen the advantage which Passepartout's escapada gave him, and delaying his departure for 12 hours, had consulted the priests of Malabar Hill. Knowing that the English authorities dealt very severely with the kind of misdemeanor, he promised them a goodly sum in damages, and sent them forward to Calcutta by the next train. Owing to the delay caused by the rescue of the young widow, Fix and the priest reached the Indian capital before Mr. Fogg and his servant. The magistrates, having been already warned by a dispatch to arrest them should they arrive, Fix's disappointment when he learned that Phileas Fogg had not made his appearance in Calcutta may be imagined. He made up his mind that the robber had stopped somewhere on the route and taken refuge in the southern provinces. For 24 hours Fix watched the station with feverish anxiety. At last he was rewarded by seeing Mr. Fogg and Passepartout arrive, accompanied by a young woman whose presentiousness he was wholly at a loss to explain. He hastened for a policeman, and this was how the party came to be arrested and brought before Judge Obadiah. Had Passepartout been a little less presumptuous, he would have espied the detective ensconced in the corner of the court-room, watching the proceedings with an interest easily understood, for the warrant had failed to reach him at Calcutta, as it had done at Bombay and Suez. Judge Odoa had fortunately caught Passepartout's rash exclamation, which the poor fellow would have given the world to recall. "The facts are admitted?" asked the judge. "Admitted," replied Mr. Fogg coldly. "As much as the English law protects equality and sternly the religions of the Indian people, and as the man Passepartout has admitted that he violated the sacred pagoda of Malabar Hill at Bombay on the 20th of October, I condemn this said Passepartout to imprisonment for 15 days and a fine of £300. £300! cried Passepartout, startled at the largeness of the sum. "Silence!" shouted the constable. "And inasmuch," continued the judge, "as it is not proved that the act was not done by the connivance of the master with the servant, and as the master in any case must be held responsible for the acts of his paid servant, I condemn Phileas Fogg to a week's imprisonment and a fine of £150. Fix rubbed his hands softly with satisfaction. If Phileas Fogg could be detained in Calcutta a week, it would be more than enough time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout was stupefied. This sentence ruined his master. A wager of £20,000 lost because he, like a precious fool, had gone into the Amdamam Pagoda. Phileas Fogg, as self-composed as if the judge did not in the least concern him, did not even lift his eyebrow while it was being pronounced. Just as the clerk was calling the next case, he rose and said, "I offer bail." "You have the right," returned the judge. Fix's blood ran cold, but he resumed his composure when he heard the judge announce that the bail required for each prisoner would be £1,000. "I will pay it at once," said Mr. Fogg, taking a roll of bank notes from the carpet bag which Passepartout had by him, and placed them on the clerk's desk. "This sum will be restored to you upon release from prison," said the judge. "Meanwhile, you are liberated on bail." "Come," said Phileas Fogg to his servant. "But let them at least give me back my shoes," cried Passepartout angrily. "Ah, these are pretty dear shoes," he muttered, as they were handed to him. "More than £1,000 apiece. Besides, they pinch my feet." Mr. Fogg, offering his arm to Aouda, then departed, followed by the crestfallen Passepartout. Fix still nourished hopes that the robber would not, after all, leave the £2,000 behind him, but would decide to serve out his week in jail, and issued forth on Mr. Fogg's traces. That gentleman took a carriage, and the party were soon landed on one of the quays. The Rangoon was moored half a mile off in the harbour, its signal of departure hoisted at the masthead. 11 o'clock was striking. Mr. Fogg was an hour in advance of time. Fix saw them leave the carriage and push off in a boat for the steamer, and stamped his feet with disappointment. "The rascal is off, after all!" he exclaimed. £2,000 sacrificed! He is as prodigal as a thief. I'll follow him to the end of the world if necessary, but at the rate he's going, the stolen money will soon be exhausted." The detective was not far wrong in making this conjecture, since leaving London, what with travelling expenses, bribes, the purchase of the elephant, bail, and fines, Mr. Fogg had already spent more than £5,000 on the way, and the percentage of the sum recovered from the bank robber promised to the detectives was rapidly diminishing. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16, in which Fix does not seem to understand in the least what is said to him. The Rangoon, one of the Peninsular and Oriental Company's boats plying in the Chinese and Japanese seas, was a screw steamer.
built of iron, weighing about 1,770 tons, and with engines of 400 horsepower. She was as fast, but not as well fitted up, as the Mongolia, and Aouda was not as comfortably provided for on board of her as Phileas Fogg could have wished. However, the trip from Calcutta to Hong Kong only comprised some 3,500 miles, occupying from 10 to 12 days, and the young woman was not difficult to please. During the first days of the journey, Aouda became better acquainted with her partner, and constantly gave evidence of her deep gratitude for what he had done. The phlegmatic gentleman listened to her appreciatively, at least with coldness, neither his voice nor his manner betraying the slightest emotion, but he seemed to be always on the watch that nothing should be wanting to Aouda's comfort. He visited her regularly, each day at certain hours, not so much to talk himself as to sit and hear her talk. He treated her with the strictest politeness, but with the precision of an automaton, the movements of which had been arranged for this purpose. Aouda did not quite know what to make of him, though Passepartout had given her some hints of his master's eccentricity, and made her smile by telling her of the wager which was sending him round the world. After all, she owed Phileas Fogg her life, and she always regarded him through the exalting medium of her gratitude. Aouda confirmed the Parsee's guide's narrative of her touching history. She did, indeed, belong to the highest of the native races of India. Many of the Parsee merchants have made great fortunes there by dealing in cotton, and one of them, Sir Jamotsi Jejebnoi, was made a baronet by the English government. Aouda was a relative of this great man, and it was his cousin Jeje whom she hoped to join at Hong Kong. Whether she would find a protector in him she could not tell, but Mr. Fogg eased to calm her anxieties, and to assure her that everything would be mathematically, he used the very word, arranged. Aouda fastened her great eyes, clear as the scared lakes of the Himalaya, upon him, but the intractable Fogg, as reserved as ever, did not seem at all inclined to throw himself into this lake. The first few days of the voyage passed prosperously, amid favourable weather and propitious winds, and they soon came in sight of the great Andaman, the principal of the islands in the Bay of Bengal, with its picturesque Saddle Peak, 2,400 feet high, looming above the waters. The steamer passed along near the shores, but the savage Papuans, who are in the lowest scale of humanity, but are not, as he had been asserted, cannibals, did not make their appearance. The panorama of the islands as they streamed by them was superb. Vast forests of palms, ilex, bamboo, teakwood, of the gigantic mimosa, and tree-like ferns covered the foreground, while behind the graceful outline of the mountains were traced against the sky, and along the coast swarmed by thousands the precious swallows, whose nests furnished a luxurious dish to the tables of the celestial empire. The varied landscape afforded by the Andaman Islands was soon passed, however, and the Ragoon rapidly approached the Straits of Malacca, which gave the access to the China Seas. What was Detective Fix so unluckily drawn one from country to country doing all this while? He had managed to embark on the Ragoon at Calcutta without being seen by Passepartout, after leaving orders that, if the warrant should arrive, it should be forwarded to him at Hong Kong, and he hoped to conceal his presence to the end of the voyage. It would have been difficult to explain why he was on board, without awakening Passepartout's suspicions, who thought him still at Bombay, but necessity impelling him nevertheless to renew his acquaintance with the worthy servant, as will be seen. All the detective's hopes and wishes were now centered on Hong Kong, for the steamer's stay at Singapore would be too brief to enable him to take any steps there. The arrest must be made at Hong Kong, or the robber would probably escape him forever. Hong Kong was the last English ground on which he could set foot. Beyond, China, Japan, America offered to Fogg an almost certain refuge, if the warrant should at least make its appearance at Hong Kong. Fix could arrest him and give him into the hands of the local police, and there would be no further trouble. But beyond Hong Kong, a simple warrant would be of no avail. An extradition warrant would be necessary, and that would result in delays and obstacles of which the rascal would take advantage to elude justice. Fix thought over these probabilities during the long hours which he spent in his cabin, and kept repeating to himself, "Now either the warrant will be at Hong Kong, in which case I shall arrest my man, or it will not be there, and this time it is absolutely necessary that I should delay his departure. I have failed at Bombay, and I have failed at Calcutta. If I fail at Hong Kong, my reputation is lost. Cost what it may, I must succeed. But how shall I prevent his departure, if that shall turn out to be my last resource?" Fix made up his mind that, if worst came to worst, he would make a confidant of Passepartout, and tell him what kind of fellow his master really was, that Passepartout was not Fogg's accomplice. He was never certain the servant, enlightened by his disclosure, and afraid of being himself implicated in the crime, would doubtless become an ally of the detective. But this method was a dangerous one, only to be employed when everything else had failed. A word from Passepartout to his master would ruin all. The detective was therefore in a sore strait. But suddenly a new idea struck him. The presence of Aouda on the Ragoon, in company with Phileas Fogg, gave him new material for reflection. Who was this woman? What combination of events had made her Fogg's travelling companion? They had evidently met somewhere between Bombay and Calcutta. But where? How they met accidentally? Or had Fogg gone into the interior purposely in quest of this charming damsel. Fix was fairly puzzled. He asked himself whether there had not been a wicked elopement, and this idea so impressed itself upon his mind that he determined to make use of this supposed intrigue, whether the young woman were married or not. He would be able to create such difficulties for Mr. Fogg at Hong Kong that he could not escape by paying any amount of money. But could he even wait till they reached Hong Kong? Fogg had an abominable way of jumping one boat to another, and before anything could be effected, might get full under way again for Yokohama. Fix decided that he must warn the English authorities and signal the Ragoon before her arrival. This was easy to do, since the steamer stopped at Singapore, whence there is a telegraphic wire to Hong Kong. He finally resolved, moreover, before acting more positively, to question Passepartout. It would not be difficult to make him talk, and as there was no time to lose, Fix prepared to make himself known. It was now the 30th of October, and on the following day the Ragoon was due at Singapore. Fix emerged from his cabin and went on deck. Passepartout was promenading up and down in the forward part of the steamer. The detective rushed forward with every appearance of extreme surprise, and exclaimed, "You here on the Ragoon?" "What, Monsieur Fix? Are you on board?" returned the rather astonished Passepartout, recognizing his crony of Mongolia. "Why, I left you at Bombay, and here you are, on the way to Hong Kong." "Are you going round the world too?" "No, no," replied Fix. "I shall stop at Hong Kong, at least for some days." Said Passepartout, who seemed for an instant perplexed. "But how is it I have not seen you on board since we left Calcutta?" "Oh, a trifle seasickness. I've been staying in my berth. The Gulf of Bengal does not agree with me as well as the Indian Ocean." "And how is Mr. Fogg?" "As well and as punctual as ever. Not a day behind time. But, Monsieur Fix, you don't know that we have a young lady with us." "A young lady?" replied the detective, not seeming to comprehend what was said. Passepartout thereupon recounted Aouda's history, the affair at the Bombay Pagoda, the purchase of the elephant for £2,000, the rescue, the arrest and sentence of the Calcutta court, and the restoration of Mr. Fogg and himself to liberty on bail. Fix, who was familiar with the last events, seemed to be equally ignorant of all that Passepartout related, and the latter was charmed to find so interesting a listener. "But does your master propose to carry this young woman to Europe?" "Not at all. We are simply going to the place. Her uncle, the protector of one of her relatives, a rich merchant at Hong Kong." "Nothing to be done there?" said Fix to himself, cancelling his disappointment. "A glass of gin, Mr. Passepartout?" "Willingly, Monsieur Fix. We must at least have a friendly glass on board the Ragoon." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17, showing what happened on the voyage from Singapore to Hong Kong. The detective and Passepartout met often on deck after this interview, though Fix was reserved, and did not attempt to induce his companion to divulge any more facts concerning Mr. Fogg. He caught a glimpse of that mysterious gentleman once or twice, but Mr. Fogg usually confided himself to the cabin, where he kept Aouda company, or, according to his inveterate habit, took a hand at whist. Passepartout began very seriously to conjecture what strange chance kept Fix still on the route that his master was pursuing. It was really worth considering why this certainly very amiable and complacent person, whom he had first met at Suez, had then encountered on board the Mongolia, who disembarked at Bombay, which he announced as his destination, and now turned up so unexpectedly on the Rangoon, was following Mr. Fogg's tracks step by step. What was Fix's objective? Passepartout was ready to wager his Indian shoes, which he religiously preserved, that Fix would also leave Hong Kong at the same time with them, and probably on the same steamer. Passepartout might have cudgelled his brain for a century without hitting upon the real object which the detective had in view. He never could have imagined that Phileas Fogg was being tracked as a robber round the globe. But as it is in human nature to tempt the solution of every mystery, Passepartout suddenly discovered an explanation of Fix's movements, which was, in truth, far from unreasonable. Fix, he thought, could only be an agent of Mr. Fogg's friends at the Reform Club, sent to follow him up, and to ascertain that he really went round the world, as been agreed upon. "It's clear," repeated the worthy servant to himself, proud of his shrewdness. "He's a spy sent to keep us in view. That isn't quite the thing either, to be spying Mr. Fogg, who is so honourable a man. Ah, gentlemen of the Reform, this shall cost you dear." Passepartout, enchanted with his discovery, resolving to say nothing to his master, lest he should be justly offended at this mistrust on the part of his adversaries. But he determined to chaff Fix when he had the chance, with mysterious allusions, which, however, need not betray his real suspicions. During the afternoon of Wednesday, 30th October, the Rangoon entered the Strait of Malacca, which separates the peninsula of that name from Sumatra. The mountains and craggy islets intercepted the beauties of this noble island from view of the travellers. The Rangoon weighed anchor at Singapore the next day, at 4 a.m., to receive coal, having gained half a day on the prescribed time of her arrival. Phileas Fogg noted this gain in his journal, and then, accompanied by Aouda, who betrayed a desire for a walk on shore, disembarked. Fix, who suspected Mr. Fogg's every movement, followed them cautiously without being himself perceived, while Passepartout, laughing at his sleeve at Fix's manoeuvres, went about his usual errands. The island of Singapore is not imposing in aspect, for there are no mountains, yet its appearance is not without attractions. It is a park checkered by pleasant highways and avenues. A handsome carriage drawn by a sleek pair of New Holland horses carried Phileas Fogg and Aouda into the midst of rows of palms with brilliant foliage and of clove trees, wherefore the cloves form the heart of a half-opened flower. Pepper plants replaced the prickly hedges of European fields. Sage bushes, large ferns with gorgeous branches varied the aspect of this tropical climate, while nutmeg trees in full foliage filled the air with a penetrating perfume.
agile and grinning bands of monkeys skipped about in the trees, nor were tigers wanted in the jungles. After a drive of 2 hours through the country, Aouda and Mr. Fogg returned to the town, which is a vast collection of heavy-looking, irregular houses surrounded by charming gardens rich in tropical fruits and plants, and at 10 o'clock they re-embarked, closely followed by the detective, who had kept them constantly in sight. Passepartout, who had been purchasing several dozen mangoes, a fruit as large as good-sized apples, of a dark brown color outside and a bright red within, and whose white pulp, melting in the mouth, affords gourmands a delicious sensation, was waiting for them on deck. He was only too glad to offer some mangoes to Aouda, who thanked him very graciously for them. At 11 o'clock the Rangoon rode out of Singapore harbour, and in a few hours the high mountains of Malacca, with their forests, inhabited by the most beautifully furnished tigers in the world, were lost to view. Singapore is distant some 1,300 miles from the island of Hong Kong, which is a little English colony near the Chinese coast. Phileas Fogg hoped to accomplish the journey in 6 days, so as to be in time for the steamer, which would leave on the 6th of November at Yokohama, the principal Japanese port. The Rangoon had a large quota of passengers, many of whom disembarked at Singapore, among the number of Indians, Ceylonese, Chinamen, Malays, and Portuguese, mostly second-class travellers. The weather, which had hitherto been fine, changed with the last quota of the moon. The sea rolled heavily, and the wind at intervals rose almost to a storm, but happily blew from the southwest, and thus aided the steamer's progress. The captain, as often as possible, put up his sails, and under the double action of steam and sail the vessel made rapid progress along the coasts of Annam and Cochin China. Owing to the defective construction of the Rangoon, however, usual precautions became necessary in unfavorable weather, but the loss of time which resulted from this cause, while it nearly drove Passepartout out of his senses, did not seem to affect his master in the least. Passepartout blamed the captain, the engineer, and the crew, and consigned all who were connected with the ship to the land where the pepper grows. Perhaps the thought of the gas, which was remorselessly burning at his expense in Savile Row, had something to do with his hot impatience. "You are in a great hurry, then," said Fix to him one day, "to reach Hong Kong?" "A very great hurry." "Mr. Fogg, I suppose, is anxious to catch the steamer for Yokohama?" "Terribly anxious." "You believe in this journey around the world, then?" "Absolutely. Don't you, Mr. Fix?" "I don't believe a word of it." "You're a sly dog," said Passepartout, winking at him. This expression rather disturbed Fix, without his knowing why. Had the Frenchman guessed his real purpose? He knew not what to think. But how could Passepartout have discovered that he was a detective? Yet, in speaking, so he did. The man evidently meant more than he expressed. Passepartout went still further the next day. He could not hold his tongue. "Mr. Fix," said he, in a bantering tone, "shall we be so unfortunate as to lose you when we get to Hong Kong?" "Why," reported Fix, a little embarrassed, "I don't know. Perhaps." "Ah, if you'd only go on with us. An agent of the Peninsular Company, you know. Can't stop on the way. You're only going to Bombay, and here you are in China. America's not far off, and from America to Europe is only a step." Fix looked intently at his companion, whose countenance were as serene as possible, and laughed with him. But Passepartout persisted in chaffing him by asking him if he made much by his present occupation. "Yes and no," returned Fix. "There is a good and bad luck in such things. But you must understand that I don't travel at my own expense." "Oh, I am quite sure of that," cried Passepartout, laughing heartily. Fix, fairly puzzled, descended at his cabin, and gave himself up to his reflections. He was evidently suspected. Somehow or other the Frenchman had found out that he was a detective. But had he told his master? What part was he playing in all this? Was he an accomplice or not? Was the game then up? Fix spent several hours turning these things over in his mind, sometimes thinking that all was lost, then persuading himself that Fogg was ignorant of his presence, and then undecided what course it was best to take. Nevertheless, he preserved his coolness of mind, and at last resolved to deal plainly with Passepartout. If he did not find it practicable to arrest Fogg at Hong Kong, and if Fogg made preparations to leave that last foothold of English territory, he, Fix, would tell Passepartout all. Either the servant was the accomplice of his master, and in this case the master knew of his operations, and he should fail, or else the servant knew nothing about the robbery, and then his interest would be to abandon the robber. Such was the situation between Fix and Passepartout. Meanwhile, Phileas Fogg moved about above them in the most majestic and unconscious indifference. He was passing methodically in his orbit around the world, regardless of the lesser stars which gravitated around him. Yet there is near by what the astronomers would call a disturbing star, which might have produced an agitation in this gentleman's heart. But no, the charm of Aouda failed to act. To Passepartout's great surprise, and disturbances, if they existed, would have been more difficult to calculate than those of Uranus, which led to the discovery of Neptune. It was every day an increasing wonder to Passepartout, who read in Aouda's eyes the depths of her gratitude to his master. Phileas Fogg, though brave and gallant, must be, he thought, quite heartless. As to the sentiment which the journey might have awakened in him, there was clearly no trace of such a thing, while poor Passepartout existed in perpetual reveries. One day he was leaning on the railing of the engine-room, and was observing the engine, when a sudden pitch of the steamer threw the screw out of the water. The steamer came hissing out of the valves, and this made Passepartout indignant. "The valves are not sufficiently charged," he exclaimed. "We are not going. Oh, these English! If this was an American craft, we should blow up, perhaps, but we should at all events go faster." End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18, in which Phileas Fogg, Passepartout, and Fix go each about his business.
The weather was bad during the latter days of the voyage. The wind, obstinately remaining in the north-west, blew a gale, and retarded the steamer. The Rangoon rolled heavily, and the passengers became impatient of the long, monstrous waves which the wind raised before their path. A sort of tempest arose on the 3rd of November, the squall knocking the vessel about with fury, and the waves running high. The Rangoon reefed all her sails, and suddenly the raging proved too much. The whistling and shaking amid the squall, the steamer was forced to proceed slowly, and the captain estimated that she would reach Hong Kong 20 hours behind time, and more if the storm lasted. Phileas Fogg gazed at the tempestuous sea, which seemed to be struggling especially to delay him. He never changed countenance for an instant, though a delay of 20 hours, by making him too late for the Yokohama boat, would almost inevitably cause the loss of the wager. But this man of nerve manifested neither impatience nor annoyance. It seemed as if the storm were a part of his programme, and had been foreseen. Iota was amazed to find him as calm as he had been from the first time she saw him. Fix did not look at the state of things in the same light. The storm greatly pleased him. His satisfaction would have been complete had the Rangoon been forced to retreat before the violence of wind and waves. Each delay filled him with hope, for it became more and more probable that Fogg would be obliged to remain some days at Hong Kong, and now the heavens themselves became his allies, with the gusts and squalls. It mattered not that they made him seasick. He made no account of this inconvenience, and whilst his body was writhing under their effects, his spirit bounded with hopeful exultation. Passepartout was enraged beyond expression by the unpropitious weather. Everything had gone so well till now. Earth and sea had seemed to be at his master's service. Steamers and railways obeyed him. Wind and steam united to speed his journey. Had the hour of adversity come, Passepartout was as much excited as if the £20,000 were to come from his own pocket. The storm exasperated him. The gale made him furious, and he longed to lash the obstinate sea into obedience. Poor fellow! Fix carefully concealed from him his own satisfaction, for had he betrayed it, Passepartout could scarcely have restrained himself from personal violence. Passepartout remained on deck as long as the tempest lasted, being unable to remain quiet below, and taking it into head to aid the progress of the ship by lending a hand with the crew. He overwhelmed the captain, officers, and sailors, who could not help laughing at his impatience, with all sorts of questions. He wanted to know exactly how long the storm was going to last, whereupon he was referred to the barometer, which seemed to have no intention of rising. Passepartout shook it, but with no perceivable effect, for neither shaking nor maledictions could prevail upon it to change its mind. On the 4th, however, the sea became more calm, and the storm lessened its violence. The wind veered southward, and was once more favourable. Passepartout cleared up with the weather. Some of the sails were unfurled, and the Rangoon resumed its most rapid speed. The time lost could not, however, be regained. Land was not signalled until 5 o'clock on the morning of the 6th. The steamer was due on the 5th. Phileas Fogg was 24 hours behindhand, and the Yokohama steamer would, of course, be missed. The pilot went on board at 6, and took his place on the bridge, to guide the Rangoon
through the channels to the port of Hong Kong. Passepartout longed to ask him if the steamer had left for Yokohama, but he dared not, for he wished to preserve the spark of hope which still remained till the last moment. He had confided his anxiety to Fix, who, the sly rascal, tried to console him by saying that Mr. Fogg would be in time if he took the next boat. But this only put Passepartout in a passion. Mr. Fogg, bolder than his servant, did not hesitate to approach the pilot, and tranquilly asked him if he knew when a steamer would leave Hong Kong for Yokohama. "At high tide tomorrow morning," answered the pilot. "Ah," said Mr. Fogg, without betraying any astonishment. Passepartout, who heard what passed, would willingly have embraced the pilot, while Fix would have been glad to twist his neck. "What's the steamer's name?" asked Mr. Fogg. "The Carnatic." "Ought she have not gone yesterday?" "Yes, sir, but they had to repair one of her bailers, and so her departure was postponed till tomorrow." "Thank you," returned Mr. Fogg, descending mathematically to the saloon. Passepartout clasped the pilot's hand and shook it heartily in his delight, exclaiming, "Pilot, you are the best of good fellows!" The pilot probably does not know to this day what his responses won him this enthusiastic greeting. He remounted the bridge, and guided the steamer through the flotilla of junks, tonks, and fishing boats which crowd the harbor of Hong Kong. At 1 o'clock the Rangoon was at the quay, and the passengers were going ashore. Chance had strangely favored Phileas Fogg, for had not the Carnatic been forced to lie over for repairing his boilers, she would have left on the 6th of November, and the passengers for Japan would have been obliged to wait for a week the sailing of the next steamer. Mr. Fogg was, it is true, 24 hours behind his time, but this could not seriously imperil the remainder of his tour. The steamer which crossed the Pacific from Yokohama to San Francisco made a direct connection with that from Hong Kong, and it could not sail until the latter reached Yokohama, and if Mr. Fogg was 24 hours late on reaching Yokohama, this time would no doubt be easily regained in the voyage of 22 days across the Pacific. He found himself then about 24 hours behindhand, 35 days after leaving London. The Carnatic was announcing to leave Hong Kong at 5 the next morning. Mr. Fogg had 16 hours in which to attend to his business there, which was to deposit Aouda safely with her wealthy relative. On landing, he conducted her to a palanquin, in which they repaired to the club hotel. A room was engaged for the young woman, and Mr. Fogg, after seeing that she wanted for nothing, set out in search for her cousin J.J. He instructed Passepartout to remain at the hotel until his return, that Aouda might not be left entirely alone. Mr. Fogg repaired to the Exchange, where he did not doubt every one would know so wealthy and considerable a personage as the Paris merchant. Meeting a broker, he made the inquiry to learn that J.J. had left China 2 years before, and retiring from business with an immense fortune, had taken up his residence in Europe. In Holland, the broker thought with the merchants of the country he had principally traded. Phileas Fogg returned to the hotel, bagged a moment's conversation with Aouda, and without more ado apprised her that J.J. was no longer at Hong Kong, but probably in Holland.
Iota at first said nothing. She passed her hand across her forehead, and reflected a few moments. Then, in her sweet, soft voice, she said, "What ought I to do, Mr. Fogg?" "It is very simple," replied the gentleman. "Go on to Europe." "But I cannot intrude." "You do not intrude, nor do you in the least embarrass my project." Passepartout, monsieur, go to the Carnatic and engage 3 cabins. Passepartout, delighted that the young woman, who was very gracious to him, was going to continue the journey with him, went off at a brisk gait to obey his master's order. End of chapter 18.